Imagine stepping into the misty corridors of history, where a single book rises from rumor, reconciliation, and cross-cultural passage to become one of the most influential manuals ever written about strategy. Foundations and historical context invites us to stand at the crossroads of biography, manuscript, and reception, to hear not only what the words of the art of war say, but how those words came to us, how they traveled, and how they have been reshaped by readers across time and space. The task before us is not simply to memorize a sequence of clever tactics, but to listen to the long echo of a text whose origins are as contested as any war it describes, whose transmission has braided through legalist statecraft, Taoist spontaneity and Confucian ideals of leadership, and whose afterlife, translated, reformulated, integrated into East Asian governance, business, and even war colleges, speaks as loudly as any battlefield account. Let us begin with the question that people ask first when they encounter the art of war: who wrote this and when? The surface of the matter is simple enough in the traditional telling. Sun Tzu, a master strategist during the ancient Chinese era known as the Spring and Autumn period, or its aftershocks in the Warring States period, penned a compact manual that would become the art of war. The name itself, Sun Tzu, often glossed as Sun Wu or Sun Tzu, anchors a figure who is as much a repository of legend as a historical trace. The biographies that circulated in later centuries, and the way later editors and commentators spoke of him, create a figure who feels both intimate and distant. A general who advised kings, a sage who communed with the world through the cunning of warfare, a name etched in the annals of military lore. Yet history, as scholars remind us, does not present us with a single, tidy manuscript when it comes to Sun Tzu. The biography that appears in the records of the Grand Historian, compiled by Sima in the 1st centuries BCE, presents Sun Tzu as a real person who lived in a troubled age, who advised rulers, and who could solve problems with a measured blend of cunning and discipline. But the same biographical tradition emphasizes that the life of Sun Tzu has become entangled with legend. The tale of his meeting with King Helu of Wu, the moment when the king is said to have learned from him and begun reforms of the army, sits alongside other accounts that sound more like fable than verifiable incident. The Baju campaign, cited as a demonstration of the speed and deception Sun Tzu valued, where the Wu state allegedly outmaneuvered its rivals with rapid mobilization and psychological surges, reads as a historical case study in tactical audacity only if we accept the underlying timeline of a figure who stands at the center of that tale. To map Sun Tzu's biography against scholarly debate, we must admit a paradox that sits at the heart of this foundational text. On the one hand, there is a coherent body of evidence, later historiography, cross-references in other works, and the textual remains that scholars associate with the art of war. That invites us to treat Sun Tzu as a genuine historical figure who contributed to a real collection of wartime maxims. On the other hand, the most persistent and persuasive scholarly arguments insist that the visible Sun Tzu of tradition is an amalgam, a possible core figure whose life was enlarged, mythologized, and edited over centuries. The book we call The Art of War, in its most widely read form, is the product of transmission, a process that did not stop in antiquity, but continued through the medieval and early modern eras, into the modern translations and global reception that we inhabit today. The text did not simply fall from the sky with an author's name bound to it. It arrived through channels of manuscript circulation, commentary, and selective preservation. What does it mean that the authorship is contested? It means that we must separate the question of who wrote the book from the question of what the book is doing in the world. The Art of War is not merely a single voice. It is a performance of strategic thinking that traveled through time. Its structure, tensely compact and highly structured, reads as an exercise in orderliness even while its content is a study in adaptiveness. The most common modern edition presents 13 chapters, each with a clear focus. Laying plans, waging war, attacking by stratagem, tactical dispositions, energy, weak points and strong, maneuvering, variation in tactics, the army on the march, terrain, the 9 situations, fire attacks, and the use of spies. But there are variant counts in manuscript traditions and in some early compilations. Some scholars point to 11 or 12 chapters, or to longer texts in which chapters cohere around different subthemes. The exact number, therefore, is not simply an arithmetic detail. It signals how readers and editors have chosen to organize a web of ideas about war, leadership, psychology, and statecraft. The text's transmission and translation history shapes interpretation as much as any line of the text itself. The Art of War has traveled outward from the Chinese heartland into Korea and Japan, then into the broader East Asian sphere, before crossing oceans and centuries to become a global work of strategy. In Korea, the text found a receptive audience among generals and scholars who were absorbing Chinese military thought into the broader fabric of statecraft and education. In Japan, the treatise was studied alongside other martial and political treatises, absorbing local refinements and becoming part of the intellectual toolkit that informed samurai leadership and daimyo governance. Each culture did not merely translate the words, it translated the assumptions and the aims behind them. What constitutes victory? What is the value of deception? How is leadership realized? And in what ceremonial or ritual contexts is strategy exercised? The result is a corpus of interpretation in which quotations move across languages and cultural frames, while the original questions about power, restraint, and cunning remain surprisingly persistent. Closely connected to the question of authorship is the structure of the text itself and the possibility of editorial layers. The 13-chapter arrangement has a clear logic that invites the reader to move from planning to execution, from the internal calculus of the general's mind to the externalities of terrain, enemy psychology, and logistics. The early editors who shaped the text could, in effect, reorder the emphasis. One reader might highlight deception and tactical cunning as the heart of the matter. Another might emphasize the psychological dimensions, the importance of knowing the enemy and oneself as the true hinge of success. In this sense, to read Sun Tzu is to encounter a mosaic rather than a single blueprint. The mosaic invites cross-referencing with other thinkers who wrestle with similar questions. How does one govern a state? How does one prevail without causing ruin? How does one balance speed and caution? How does one turn information into advantage? Understanding the art of war in relation to its broader intellectual milieu helps us see why it has endured and how it has been interpreted across time. A central portion of that milieu is the long conversation among Taoist, Confucian, legalist, Mohist, and even military thinkers who sought to understand how a state should behave in times of flux. Taoist influences, especially the currents associated with Laozi, Lao Tzu, and the broader school associated with Wu Wei, offer a counterpoint to the aggressive virtues of certain martial texts. The Taoist mood is one of alignment with the flow of things, a certain subtlety in action that yields results through minimal force or through actions that appear effortless because they are in tune with a larger order. The Taoist line of thought that emphasizes non-striving, spontaneity, and the soft overpowering the hard supplies a philosophical backdrop for reading the art of war not only as a manual for how to win battles, but as a guide to perceiving when battles are unnecessary or unwarranted. A well-known Taoist idea that resonates here is the predication that the soft overcomes the hard and the weak overcomes the strong. In a text that foregrounds deception, misdirection, and the nimble reframing of problems, the Taoist sensibility invites us to see strategy as a form of alignment rather than a brute force display. Conversely, legalist thought, often associated with figures like Han Fei and the broader stream of statecraft that emphasizes strict laws, centralized control, and the primacy of the state, offers a complement and sometimes a counterweight to the more fluid and opportunistic readings of Sun Tzu. The legalists stress the necessity of disciplined administration, sharply defined penalties, and a clear chain of command. They provide a framework in which strategy is inseparable from the machinery of governance. When we encounter the art of war in a legalist context, we often hear the talk of order as a precondition for winning battles, of the state's strength as a precondition for the ability to deceive or maneuver. The reader who sits with both Taoist flexibility and legalist discipline can hear how Sun Tzu's advice on positioning, on speed, on the use of information and spies fits inside a broader project of making a state formidable, reliable, and adaptive while preserving social order. And it is not incidental that much of East Asian martial history and administration took shape in spaces where these diverse theories interacted, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. Beyond this triad of Taoist, Confucian, and legalist influences, Mohist pragmatism provides a further lens. The Mohists, with their emphasis on impartial benevolence and usefulness, bring a utilitarian critique and a demand for effectiveness. When the art of war speaks of achieving the best results with the least cost, or of maximizing advantage while minimizing unnecessary risk, it echoes a kind of Mohist calculus. The Mohists might ask, what is the utility of war in a given political context? Under what conditions does victory enhance the common good, and when does profit and advantage come at too high a cost to be ethically justified? Sun Tzu's orbit, then, is not morally homogeneous. It engages with questions of virtue and expediency that the Mohists, Confucians, and Taoists all weigh differently, depending on the arguments they prize. To talk about the authorship and the text in tandem with such intellectual currents is to lay out a map of influences rather than a single genealogical line. Modern scholars and translators who make these cross-references often do not present a single, definitive Sun Tzu. Instead, they stage a conversation across sources, sometimes comparing the art of war with Sun Bin's art of war and with Wu Qi's strategic writings in order to trace continuities and divergences. The name Sun Bin evokes another line of tradition, Sun Bin, a likely relative or disciple of Sun Tzu, whose own text has a distinct lineage and whose timescales intersect with the same historical fields. When scholars compare Sun Tzu with Sun Bin and Wu Qi, they are not pitting rival authors against one another. They are tracing an ecosystem of strategic thought in the warring states that uses allegory, case study, and aphorism to articulate how a state might survive and thrive through conflict. The cross-referencing across Sun Tzu, Sun Bin, and Wu Qi helps to illuminate recurrent motifs: deception, speed, the measurement of risk, the organization of the army, the psychology of the enemy, and the role of leadership in aligning a populace with the aims of the ruler. There are within this ecosystem other voices and textures worth noting. The text's diffusion into East Asia is not an easy translation from one language to another. It is a translation of social practices, of military education, of strategic imagination. In Korea, the reception of the art of war blended with a strong tradition of statecraft and Confucian governance, while absorbing the Taoist and Mohist sensibilities in ways that mattered for governance, court politics, and military education. In Japan, the text fed into a culture of strategic thought and martial discipline, where the seafront of war and the calm of governance intersected with the aesthetics of strategy. The diffusion was not merely linguistic. It was practical and institutional. The art of war migrated into the schools of generals and advisors, into treatises used by courtiers and military commanders, into samurai and daimyo councils, and eventually into the modern world where business leaders, diplomats, and policymakers turn to it for a vocabulary of competition and resilience. The translation projects, whether through Chinese to Korean, Chinese to Japanese, or later Western interpretive efforts, became an ongoing act of recommentary. Translators are not neutral archaeologists of text. They become interpreters who shape how a text is understood in a given time and place. In tracing the historical context, we must tell two intertwined kinds of story: a narrative about the text's bio and a narrative about its textual life. On the bio side, a legendary meeting between Sun Tzu and King Helu of Wu is told as a dramatic hinge in the story of the Wu state's reform program. The anecdote is that Helu, impressed by Sun Tzu's sense of timing, reformed his army to be leaner, more disciplined, and more responsive to intelligence. The narrative invites us to see Sun Tzu not only as a strategist who composes plans, but as a catalyst who initiates organizational changes that render a state more agile in the face of adversaries. The Baju campaign that comes with this lore, an instance of rapid mobilization, movement, and decisive deception, offers a set piece, a practical demonstration of the values that the text champions. The result is a culture of strategic thinking, in which the best victory is one that accomplishes political aims with minimal bloodshed or waste, a principle that would resonate in later centuries and reformulations of waging war or settling disputes. The other thread in the biography is a biographical counter-thread, the fragmentary record, the rumor, the historiographical caution that accompanies any claim about the life of Sun Tzu. In Shiji, the grand narrative of early Chinese history, we glimpse a silhouette of Sun Tzu as a soldier and thinker, but the details about his life are not as intact as we might wish. The legendary meeting with King Helu, the reforms, the wisdom that is attributed to him, these exist side by side with other accounts that raise questions of dating, authorship, and the possibility of later interpolation. In other words, the biography is a tapestry that reflects how people in later ages wanted to read the text, as if the text carried forward a living tradition of cunning rulers and prudent generals who could bring order or victory through cleverness rather than through brute force alone. The tension between the legend and the fragmentary record invites careful reading. We should honor the historical reality that there may have been a Sun Tzu or a Sun family with a strategic tradition, while acknowledging that the precise biographical skeleton may be uncertain or revised by more recent scholarship. A natural question follows: given the contested biography and the manuscript history, how does one make sense of the text itself? The architectural beauty of the art of war lies in how it is both compact and capacious. Its 13 chapters, with their careful progression from planning to execution, invite a method for thinking about conflict that makes room for logistics, terrain, enemy psychology, and intelligence. The book does not offer a single recipe, rather, it offers a coherent repertoire of dispositions and principles that can be adapted to countless settings. The recurring idea is not simply to win battles, but to win the right battles, to know when to strike, when not to strike, and how to align military means with political ends. The text's attention to deception makes it both seductive and controversial. To what degree can deception be ethically justified or practically sustainable in governance? How does one balance deception with transparency in leadership? These questions are historically and philosophically significant because they reveal how strategy can be used for different kinds of ends, and how a text that prescribes cunning can still speak to ethics, governance, and the common good. A crucial piece of the modern scholarly conversation is the project of close textual reading and the awareness of how translations shape understanding. The Art of War is not a museum piece whose meaning is fixed in stone. It is a living document that changes with each translation, with each editorial emphasis, and with each cultural frame that interprets it. The translators and editors who work on Sun Tzu often face a set of interpretive decisions. How literally to render deception, how to handle the concept of terrain, how to translate the esoteric terms that refer to logistics, mobilization, and intelligence networks. The field of translation studies, when applied to the art of war, offers a lens through which we can see the text not as a canonical artifact, but as a phenomenon shaped by the needs and preoccupations of different eras. The decision to foreground speed and surprise, or to foreground the ethical considerations of leadership, is not simply a textual choice. It is a historiographical choice that reflects what readers want to glean from a universal manual of strategy. As we consider the influence of Taoism and Confucianism on strategic thinking, it is worth returning to the two quotes that anchor a broader conversation about power and action. Sun Tzu offers a line that has become almost a motto in discussions of strategy. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is not a call to passivity, but an invitation to seize the most important ends with the least necessary means. It echoes a Taoist insight into non-resistance and appropriate timing. To know when to let things unfold, to know how to shape conditions so that the resolution arises from the environment rather than from force alone. The same line also challenges martial readers to recognize that the ultimate triumph is political and social as much as it is military. It asks us to consider what victory means in a broad sense. Victory in governance, victory in shaping opinion, victory in the ability to govern with minimal damage to the community. By contrast, Laozi's phrases about the soft overcoming the hard provide a philosophical counterpoint to the more aggressive rhetoric of the battlefield. The idea of yielding and flexibility, an approach of minimal constraint that yields maximum effect, offers a complementary vocabulary for understanding strategic success. This Taoist lens helps to remind us that the text's emphasis on speed and deception is not an entirely amoral calculus. It is a reflection of a worldview in which harmony with the natural order can be a route to effectiveness. It also raises questions about how to apply these ideas in peacetime contexts. If the best strategy in war is to avoid fighting, how should a state or organization cultivate resilience, negotiation, and preparedness for the long horizon of political life? In this conversation with Confucian thought, we meet a different emphasis: leadership virtue, moral exemplar, political legitimacy. Confucian influence insists that rulers cultivate benevolence, righteousness, and ritual propriety, and that the state's strength is inseparable from the moral character of its leaders. The art of war's practical, utilitarian logic can sometimes appear to run counter to such virtue ethics, especially if the book is read as a blueprint for ruthless tactics. Yet many readers and interpreters have found a synthesis. Sun Tzu's guidance can be read as a discipline that protects the governed, that seeks to minimize ruin in a dangerous world, and that demands a ruler who can read circumstances with discernment and who understands the consequences of actions for the social order. If Confucian virtue anchors governance in moral purpose, Sun Tzu adds a sharpened prism of situational awareness, risk assessment, and the discipline of organization. The tension and harmony between these currents illuminate how East Asian political ethics have long integrated the art of managing power with the art of leading people toward a common good. We should also look outward to the broader world and note the parallels and contrasts with Western tradition. In the West, Clausewitz's On War offers a canonical modern reflection on war's political character, the fog of war, and the moral hazards of violence in pursuit of political ends. While Clausewitz emphasizes the overthrow of enemies and the political logic of war as the continuation of policy by other means, Sun Tzu emphasizes the possibility of winning without fighting. The two voices share a preoccupation with purpose, precision, and the costs of conflict, yet they diverge in how they conceive the most effective path to success. Machiavelli, writing about power, statecraft, and the practical realities of political life, offers a different philosophical stance from Sun Tzu. He emphasizes the pragmatics of rule, the necessity of courage, and the sometimes ruthless calculus of maintaining power. Reading Sun Tzu alongside Machiavelli and Clausewitz invites a broader conversation about how strategy functions in different historical and cultural contexts, and how a text born in the Chinese heartland can speak to leaders and thinkers across the world, in business rooms as in battlefields. Let us now anchor these discussions with concrete examples and anecdotes, so that the ideas arrive not as abstractions but as living images in a landscape of memory and travel. First, the Baju campaign. The story of Baju has often been invoked as the model of speed, surprise, and tactical audacity. The Wu commander is said to have launched a rapid march across a precarious river route, to have exploited the element of surprise, and to have pressed the advantage with a level of decisiveness that left the Yue forces at a moment of disarray. This anecdote is a touchstone used to illustrate how a small or disciplined army can achieve a dramatic strategic effect against a larger or more complacent foe. Whether or not every detail of the Baju anecdote happened exactly as the legends describe, the moral remains legible. The power of tempo, of exploiting uncertainty, of finishing a conflict before the adversary has time to reorganize. It is a practical case study in deception and speed, and in the way a commander translates a plan into a sequence of decisive, disorienting moves on the ground. Second, the legendary meeting with King Helu and the reforms to Wu's army. This tale of Sun Tzu presenting a diagnostic reading of the Wu military situation, of advising reforms, functions as a narrative device that links Sun Tzu's principles to institutional change. The story imagines a ruler listening to a strategist who can translate abstract principles into administrative and organizational reforms, streamlined training, disciplined supply lines, improved intelligence networks, and a more agile deployment tempo. The meeting is not just a scene. It is a conceptual turning point that invites us to think of strategy as a form of governance that requires both the lion's courage and the fox's cunning. It's a reminder that strategic vision is inseparable from the architecture of the state. The vigor of a plan depends on the coordination of people, resources, and institutions. And then the diffusion to Korea and Japan, where the art of war took root in educational and military traditions. In Korea, the text was integrated into the court's governance repertoire and into the broader intellectual ecosystem that included Confucian scholarship and Taoist thought. The adoption did not occur in a vacuum. It intersected with local notions of legitimacy, state formation, military organization, and education. In Japan, the art of war found a parallel life in the world of daimyo politics, castle warfare, and samurai leadership, where strategy was tested in both political negotiation and military action. The diffusion into East Asia created a layered reception. In each culture, the Chinese text was not merely translated but domesticated. Its judgments about timing, leadership, deception, and resource management were translated into practical heuristics used by states and armies with their own conditions, technologies, and social norms. This East Asian diffusion later prepared the way for Western readers in the 19th and 20th centuries to encounter the book in a context of global military and strategic studies, where Clausewitz and Machiavelli would sit in conversation with Sun Tzu within classrooms and libraries. The diffusion and reception have not stopped with the era of print. The modern globalization of Sun Tzu includes an emphasis on business strategy, competitive intelligence, and organizational leadership. In corporate boardrooms and management seminars around the world, the art of war has been read as a text that can illuminate negotiation, alliance building, and risk mitigation. The idea that all warfare is based on deception has been repurposed in many contexts as a call to manage information ethically, to think about competition without resorting to harm for the sake of gain, and to be mindful of how misperception can undo a plan even when the best intentions are at stake. Yet this modern reappropriation must be approached with caution. The ethics of competition in the marketplace, the responsibilities of governance, and the social costs of conflict all require a careful, nuanced reading of Sun Tzu in a contemporary frame. We need to discern where the ancient text's analogies fit modern problems and where they risk becoming templates for harm if applied without critical reflection. In approaching translations and manuscript history, we must appreciate why translation matters so deeply. When a translator renders a phrase that in Chinese carries a spectrum of nuance, terms that can mean technique, cunning, strategy, or officious craft, the reader receives a particular emphasis depending on the translator's choices. A phrase that in one edition is captured as all warfare is based on deception may in another edition be given a slightly different shade, warfare rests on cunning, or warfare is built upon stratagem. The subtle tilt can change how readers conceive of the practice of strategy. As a sphere of moral choice, as a field of tactical cunning, or as a cognitive discipline of anticipation and planning. The same is true for terms relating to terrain, leadership, supply, and the use of spies. The translation choices are not trivial side effects. They are central to how a text inhabits different intellectual ecosystems, becomes useful in different professional contexts, and speaks to readers with different questions. As we survey the field, we must also acknowledge the debates about whether the text reflects a single ancient voice, or whether it contains later commentary or editorial layering. Some scholars argue that the core of the art of war may well belong to Sun Tzu or to a close circle, but that the version that reached later readers is a composite, perhaps including commentarial additions that situate the work within a longer tradition of strategic thought. If that is the case, the text's historical coherence is not a weakness but a feature, a record of how strategic wisdom was refined across generations, how it was reinterpreted to fit new political needs, and how it served as a shared language for actors in different centuries and environments. In that sense, the voice of Sun Tzu is the voice of a tradition that continues to adapt, challenge, and be reinterpreted by readers who want to understand the dynamics of power and the art of governance in new settings. To be precise about counterarguments is to recognize the limits of our knowledge while still making intelligent readings. The first counterargument is straightforward and robust. The historicity of Sun Tzu is debated. Are we certain that a figure named Sun Tzu existed, and did he compose a text that was later named after him? The evidence is suggestive but not definitive. The Shiji offers a traditional biographical frame, but it is not a contemporary source for the bulk of the art of war. The second counterargument is that the work may reflect later commentary or editorial layering rather than a single ancient voice. If this is the case, then the text's historical place should be understood as a living tradition rather than a verbatim archive. The third counterargument concerns an overemphasis on war as the central frame for understanding the art of war. In peacetime, the book's lessons can be misapplied to governance, relationships, or social life in ways that are ethically complex or practically inappropriate. This is not a fatal objection to the text, but it is a warning against reducing strategy to a dramatic set of battlefield tricks. The fourth counterargument is that the text's emphasis on speed, deception, and winning without fighting can become an invitation to corrosive manipulation if treated as a universal manual for all situations. The modern reader must differentiate between strategic thinking that is ethically responsible and tactical opportunism that can produce harm. These counterarguments, far from discrediting the art of war, encourage a more careful, historically aware, and ethically attentive engagement with the text. Against these counterarguments stands a robust body of cross-references and scholarly lines of thought that illuminate how the art of war dialogues with other thinkers and how its ideas cross boundaries. Contemporary scholars regularly place Sun Tzu in conversation with Sun Bin, Wu Qi, and other strategists whose works illuminate a shared ecosystem of warring states, era political and military thought. The cross-reference is not merely a matter of textual similarity. It reveals parallel concerns: how to deploy troops with maximum effect while minimizing risk, how to read terrain and social landscapes, how to distinguish between deception and truth, and how to structure command and governance for swift, accurate response to changing conditions. The cross-references extend beyond the local to the global. The parallels with Clausewitz in the sense that war is a political instrument, the parallels with Machiavelli in the art of political realism, and even a cautious resonance with certain modern management theories that view competition as an environment where information, timing, and strategy determine outcomes. If we turn to the question of modern interpretations, we find a field that remains as dynamic as the text itself. The art of war is invoked in classrooms and corporate strategy sessions, in the analysis of international diplomacy, in the operations rooms of government agencies, and in the study of leadership ethics. Yet the modern interpreter bears responsibility to honor the historical particularity of the text and its transmission while applying its insights in ways that respect human beings and institutions. The modern reader has to contend with the fact that war is no longer an ethical blueprint for contemporary governance in many contexts, even though the analytical tools, risk assessment, situational awareness, scenario planning, and the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances retain relevance. The translation into business language, competitive intelligence, supply chain resilience, agile leadership, must be done with humility, recognizing that a text born in a world of state conflict, specialized armies, and dynastic politics cannot be transported wholesale into unrelated domains without reinterpreting its aims. Let us end by articulating a few more anchors, the anchors that can help the reader move from curiosity to understanding. First, the call to close textual reading. To examine how a phrase operates within a chapter, how a line of guidance unfolds into advice about a complex situation, how a principle translates into a recommended action. This is not merely a literary exercise. It is a method for thinking about strategy itself, how a general evaluates risk, how an organization assesses internal and external conditions, how leadership makes decisions under the pressure of limited resources and uncertain futures. Second, the attention to manuscript history and translation, to appreciate how the art of war's meaning shifts with language, context, and the needs of the reader, and to see how the text has become functionally universal while remaining historically particular. Third, the insistence on cross-referencing with related thinkers and with broader intellectual currents, that the text is best understood not as a solitary oracle, but as part of a lively conversation about power, ethics, culture, and human flourishing in times of risk and change. In this light, we can hear a few lines from primary sources that illuminate the soul of the discourse. The art of war opens with a recognition of the stakes. The art of war is of vital importance to the state. The emphasis here is not on art for art's sake, but on the practical necessity of knowing how to navigate conflict to preserve life, order, and the possibility of future flourishing. The text then offers its core maxim: all warfare is based on deception. The emphasis is not to celebrate deception as an end in itself, but to recognize that perception, how the enemy sees the situation, what information is available, what misreading might occur, can decide the outcome as surely as any physical maneuver. Then there is the famous triad of knowledge. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. The exhortation here is not simply to accumulate information, but to cultivate a certain kind of cognitive discipline. The discipline to study tendencies, to map probabilities, to differentiate between appearances and realities, to align intention with consequence. From the Taoist side, a concise text like Tao Te Ching offers a companion horizon, even if it does not speak directly of warfare. A well-known line, "the soft overcomes the hard, the weak overcomes the strong," invites a different intuition about power. When we pair this with Sun Tzu's insistence on flexibility, timing, and the ethical weight of leadership, we begin to sense a larger architecture of strategy that does not reduce human action to brute force. The Taoist voice suggests that strategy must be anchored in an appropriate humility before the larger order of things, in a refusal to force outcomes when a more harmonious route is possible. The Confucian voice, for its part, speaks of the moral responsibilities of rulers and the cultivation of virtue as a foundation for stable governance. The contrast is not a clash but a chorus. A recognition that strategy lives in the space where political ends, personal character, and social order must align. In the end, Foundations and Historical Context is not only a history of a book, but a meditation on how ancient texts live in the present through question, critique, and reimagining. The Art of War is a text that gains its authority from the way it has functioned across centuries, as a toolkit for actors in the worlds of kings and generals, merchants and diplomats, educators and students. The questions it poses about leadership, risk, timing, and information remain pressing across different eras. The debates about authorship remind us that texts do not exist in a vacuum. They are born of particular social worlds, and they travel through time as living artifacts whose meanings shift with readers' needs. The chapter counts and textual variations teach us to read carefully, to attend to how a book is put together just as much as to what the book says. The broader intellectual milieu, the Taoist insistence on harmony and adaptability, the Confucian emphasis on virtuous leadership, the legalist commitment to order and discipline, the Mohist concern with usefulness and welfare, enriches our understanding of how Sun Tzu's ideas could animate a resilient political and military project, and how those very ideas can be reinterpreted to speak to modern concerns about strategy, ethics, and governance. The East Asian diffusion of the work, its translation into different tongues, and its reception in Korea, Japan, and beyond, offer a powerful reminder that strategic thinking travels, matures, and renews itself through contact with other cultures and eras. And if we listen carefully, we hear the echoes of another timeless lesson, a reminder that sometimes the best victory is the one that avoids unnecessary ruin, that success flows from the right timing, the right readers, and the right structures for action. The Art of War, in its origins, in its transmission, and in its ongoing reception, asks us to weigh not only what to do in a given moment, but how to understand the conditions that make such a moment possible. It asks us to consider how a state or organization can prepare for conflict without becoming consumed by it, how leadership can cultivate both the courage to act decisively and the restraint to know when not to act. It asks us to think about the places where deception helps, but also where transparency is a virtue. It asks us to acknowledge that strategy is always a human practice, a practice of judgment under uncertainty, of reading signs, of balancing risk against imagined futures, and of coordinating collective action toward a shared aim. In this sense, the origins of the art of war are not only a chronology of events, or a tally of battlefield tactics, or a string of rumored conversations with a legendary Sun Tzu. They are a reminder of how humans have always tried to navigate danger and opportunity with minds that are creative, disciplined, and morally aware. The text's journey from a possible home in the courts and battlefields of the ancient Chinese world to a trans-Pacific, transcontinental, and transdisciplinary beacon for modern readers speaks to the enduring human questions about power, responsibility, and the art of living well amid uncertain times. The hero of the story is not simply a general who wins battles. It is a culture, a method, and a way of thinking that invites us to study, to question, and to improve. So as you watch this segment about foundations and historical context, I invite you to carry with you two threads at once. The thread of the particular, the careful cataloging of dates, biographical fragments, manuscript traditions, and the precise structure of the 13 chapters. And the thread of the universal, the ways in which Sun Tzu's ideas speak across centuries and across cultures, how they shape our understanding of leadership, risk, information, and the moral imagination of strategy. Read the chapter about laying plans and think about the first move in any enterprise. What information do you need? How will you know you are in the right moment to act? How do you measure the cost of action? Then turn to the chapter on terrain and consider how place and space structure decisions in war and in negotiation alike. Reflect on the method of deception, how to recognize it in the world, how to use it ethically as a tool for preserving life, how to resist becoming a victim of misperception yourself. And finally, listen for the echo of Taoist intuition in the background, the sense that in strategy, as in life, there is a path, an order, a spontaneity that emerges when action aligns with the flow of circumstances rather than against them. As you sit with these ideas, remember that the art of war is not a museum piece, but a living document that has traveled far beyond its birthplace. Its authorship may be debated, its text may have grown in layers, and its chapters may have shifted in emphasis across editions. Yet the questions that it raises, how do we lead, how do we respond to uncertainty, how do we win with wisdom rather than merely with force, are as urgent now as they were in the first echoes of the Sun Tzu legend. The journey of Sun Tzu's thought through the ages, through the lens of Sun Bin, Wu Qi, Taoist and Confucian ethical concerns, and the modern translators who navigate cross-cultural landscapes, offers a reminder that the ancient world remains a teacher. Its lessons are not tickets to a victory parade, but invitation to a disciplined, reflective life in the presence of risk. And in that invitation lies the deepest intrigue of this foundational work, to show us that strategy is a way of seeing the world as it is, and as it could be, if we in our institutions learn how to act with both cunning and conscience in the face of uncertainty. Sun Tzu's philosophy arrives not as a cheap maxim, but as a language spoken to those who would lead, persuade, and endure. In the core of his thought stands a stubborn, almost paradoxical clarity. Victory is possible, often preferable, when you know more about the terrain, more about your own strengths and limits, and more about what your adversary desires to believe than about the other side's bravado. This is a philosophy built around information, timing, and the art of shaping outcomes with as little cost as possible. If you listen closely, you hear a patient call to restraint as a form of strategy, a discipline that sees war as a last instrument and a means to preserve life, resources, and legitimacy. The title of our section, Core Principles, Knowledge, Deception, and the Art of Winning, signals a triptych that asks us to examine not merely how to win, but how to win in a way that respects the conditions under which decisions are made and the relationships that will carry or ruin us in the long run. To begin, let us anchor ourselves in origins. Sun Tzu, traditionally identified as the author of the art of war, belongs to a long Chinese tradition of strategic thought that blends practical military craft with a larger moral and social horizon. The text likely took shape during the tumultuous Warring States period, a century of shifting alliances, betrayals, innovations, and experiments in political power. It is both a handbook for generals and a guide to rulers, merchants, officials, and even athletes who want to understand the logic of competition under pressure. The book's voice is austere and efficient, a style that insists that strategy must translate into action that is swift, precise, and adaptable. It is not a romance of triumph. It is a sober account of how to harness knowledge, how to manage uncertainty, and how to constrain conflict so that the price of winning does not exceed the value of the victory itself. The five factors that many scholars read Sun Tzu as arranging the landscape around victory, moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method, offer a deceptively simple grid that nevertheless opens into a vast field of inquiry. Moral law refers to the alignment of the ruler with the people's trust, purpose, and shared ethos. It is what makes a nation cohere under pressure. Heaven is the broad, impersonal dimension of timing, seasonality, luck, and the forces that shape events beyond any single actor's control. Earth encompasses geography, terrain, logistics, and the practical realities of movement and supply. The commander embodies leadership virtue, personal example, discipline, and the capacity to read a situation with prudence and courage. Method concerns organization, rank, command structure, planning, and the allocation of resources to strategic ends. Taken together, these five factors form a holistic lens. Strategy is not only about cunning tricks, but about aligning a living organization with larger currents and with the ethical texture of the moment. Now, let us consider the core argument about knowledge. Sun Tzu's most famous line, translated in many ways but often rendered as, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles," remains a sentence that invites quiet reflection rather than boastful bravado. The claim is not simply that information is powerful, but that the governance of information, what to know, when to know it, how to act on it, decides the arc of conflict. Knowledge, in Sun Tzu's frame, is both outward and inward. You must read the other side's intentions, capabilities, timing, and constraints, but you must also understand your own limits, the hidden costs behind every choice, and the ethical and political implications of your actions. The text adds a complementary reminder in the line often cited as all warfare is based on deception. This maxim is not a celebration of lies, it is a doctrine about signaling and perception under conditions of uncertainty. If the other side cannot tell what you truly intend, they will hesitate in ways that create valuable openings for you. In the same breath, Sun Tzu insists that deception has a price and a boundary. He is not asking his reader to lie without restraint. He asks them to consider whether deception is the most efficient route to reducing risk and cost. He follows the thread with a principle that has haunted strategists across ages. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Here the aim is not to glorify cleverness for its own sake, but to recognize that pageloads of violence and the costs of prolonged conflict often produce outcomes that are inferior to outcomes achieved through influence, misdirection, credible commitments, and timely disengagement. The line invites us to reflect on the ethics of warfare, the limits of power, and the possibility that strength is not merely the capacity to impose will, but the capacity to shape choices so that the adversary's own incentives bend toward your preferred result. To enter more deeply into the practical architecture of Sun Tzu's thought, we should translate the idea of winning by indirect means into modern terms without sacrificing its nuance. Indirect means, in Sun Tzu's vocabulary, are about shaping the field of play so that direct confrontation becomes unnecessary or far less costly. They may involve feints, misdirection, the use of terrain, or the manipulation of timing to catch the opponent in a vulnerability. Indirect strategy is not cowardice, it is sophistication. It recognizes that the battlefield is a landscape of incentives and perceptions as much as it is a physical space. A commander who can induce an opponent to misread their direct threat, who makes the other side believe that a risky action is more valuable or dangerous than it actually is, can win by the gravity of miscalculation as much as by the force of arms. The appeal to indirect means also resonates with a broader tradition in East Asian thought, where flexibility, subtlety, and a sense of harmony with larger processes are prized as prudent forms of governance and leadership. Let us now hold the five factors before us and examine them more closely, not as dry categories, but as living forces that must be negotiated in any real contest. Moral law, or the moral vision that binds a community to a shared purpose, is the first lantern you must light. In Sun Tzu's world, legitimacy is the oxygen that sustains a state in times of stress. When moral law is strong, people understand what they are fighting for. They trust their leaders, even when patience is required. In modern terms, this means that a polity or a company with a robust, ethically coherent mission has a reservoir of goodwill that can be drawn upon when prices rise or risks escalate. But moral law is fragile. It falters when leaders betray promises, when the public perceives that costs are borne by the many while the few gain from cunning or opportunism, or when deception erodes trust to an extent where the long arc of legitimacy appears to be pay-to-play rather than a shared project. Heaven and earth in Sun Tzu's lexicon are more than poetic personifications. Heaven denotes the time in which acts occur, the seasonality, the weather, the rhythms of life that tune the possibilities of action. It is the recognition that timing is a decisive instrument. A move at the right moment can turn a marginal advantage into a decisive victory, while impatience can trigger a cascade of mistakes. Earth represents terrain and logistics, the material bedrock on which plans either stand or fall. If you cannot feed your army, if your supplies dry up, or if your routes are clogged or vulnerable, even the most brilliant strategy will founder. Taken together, heaven and earth insist that strategic thinking must be grounded in a realistic mapping of opportunities and constraints, not in idealized fantasies of cleverness. The commander embodies virtue in a way that blends moral authority with practical competence. Sun Tzu's ideal general is not merely a tactician, but a leader who can read the mood of troops, inspire discipline, and make decisions with both speed and care. This is a figure who embodies trust, clarity of purpose, and the ability to adapt to shifting circumstances. In contemporary terms, we might read this as the leader who couples ethical aspiration with operational excellence, who models restraint when aggression might offer a momentary advantage, and who communicates a vision that keeps the team oriented toward a shared objective, even as the field of play changes rapidly. Method, or the organization and discipline that translate plan into action, is the infrastructure of success. It involves clear command, reliable processes, credible information channels, and efficient execution. Method ensures that a nation or a company can mobilize its resources, synchronize actions across units, and maintain coherence under pressure. Poor method, conflict-laden, opaque, or indecisive, makes even noble aims fragile and vulnerable to disruption. These 5 factors do not operate in a vacuum. They are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Moral law inflames or dampens the energy that heaven and earth present through timing and terrain. A virtuous commander earns trust and inspires the workforce in a way that makes the method work more smoothly, even when the environment is difficult. The most elegant practical fruit of the framework emerges when a leader aligns the people's will, the seasonal opportunities, the geographic realities, the leadership example, and the logistical architecture into a coherent system that can adapt to a changing opponent and a shifting political climate. Sun Tzu rarely offers metaphysical guarantees. Rather, he provides a theory of alignment, how to harmonize multiple streams of constraint and opportunity so that the probability of success increases without exaggerating one's strength or overreaching in a way that invites ruin. With the rigor of a field manual, the art of war also insists on a sober, sometimes paradoxical assessment of risk. The most famous maxim about knowledge, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles, is not simply about one-on-one combat. It is about the asymmetry of information, about how miscalculation grows when a party refuses to acknowledge the limits of its knowledge. The sentence also invites a deeper reflection on self-knowledge. What are my biases? What do I want most? What is the true cost of my choices? And how do I calibrate my own desires to the demands of the situation? Consider the companion line that appears in many translations. All warfare is based on deception. Deception here is not a license for duplicity in every relationship, but a recognition that in some circumstances perception becomes a strategic asset, and shaping perception can alter the outcome in a way that reduces risk and cost. But deception is not a free pass. It must be credible, proportionate, and bound by the larger political and ethical frame of the time. The line sits within a cautious code. Deception is a tool, not a creed. It should be used when it serves the objective of protecting life and minimizing harm, and it should be avoided when it would erode essential trust and legitimacy in the long term. To give some texture to the argument, let us anchor the discussion with textual anchors from primary sources and attend carefully to translation and interpretation. The art of war is not a single, fixed document. It exists in a tradition of Chinese writing that has been translated into many languages, each with its own shades of meaning. The phrase often rendered as "if you know the enemy and know yourself" can also be translated as "if you know both your own and the enemy's situations, you will not fear the result of 100 battles." Translation choices matter because they shape our sense of what Sun Tzu takes as essential. One translator may emphasize knowledge as epistemic mastery, another as situational awareness. One may stress the moral and political implications, another the tactical calculus of risk. Similarly, all warfare is based on deception can appear in slightly different formulations. Deception as a technique, deception as a condition of the battlefield, or deception as a broader principle about the management of uncertainty. The challenge for readers and listeners is to hold these variants in mind, to recognize that the text operates like a living instrument that invites reinterpretation in light of new circumstances. The ultimate anchor remains consistent: Strategy is a discipline of reading conditions and shaping them through disciplined action. Now, if we were to translate Sun Tzu into modern sectors such as policy, business, sports, and personal life, what would a rigorous, practical application look like? Let us begin with corporate strategy, a realm where the language of competition often resembles a battlefield, but where the terrain is a market, a supply chain, and a web of stakeholders. A corporate strategy that uses market intelligence to avoid head-to-head battles would, in Sun Tzu's frame, be a strategic alignment of knowledge with terrain and timing. Imagine a technology firm that recognizes a field where two major players are about to collide over a particular market segment with high capital costs and limited growth. Instead of rushing into a price war or feature race that would erode margins for all, the firm leverages market intelligence to identify a niche or a terrain advantage where the opponent's strengths do not translate into durable advantages. It might choose to partner with a complementary player, to acquire a smaller rival to remove a potential threat from the field, or to wait for a regulatory or technological inflection that would tilt the playing field in its favor. The strategic move is not merely a clever trap, but a disciplined reallocation of risk, an indirect approach designed to minimize the cost of victory while preserving long-term legitimacy in the eyes of customers and regulators. In this sense, Sun Tzu's thought echoes through modern management theories of competitive strategy, where firms seek to create asymmetries in information or resource allocation that discourage direct confrontation and tilt the odds in their favor. In diplomacy and negotiations, the Sun Tzu frame emphasizes credible commitments and misdirection to shape outcomes. A classical moment for reflection is the use of signaling in diplomacy. What is said, what is kept secret, what is made public, and how each move is perceived by the other side and by third parties. A negotiation tactic that embodies Sun Tzu's spirit is to present a credible commitment to protect a core interest, B. Constrain a risky course of action, or C. Reveal a preferred path only when it becomes strategically advantageous for one side to do so. Misalignment, such as signaling willingness to walk away from a deal while simultaneously preparing parallel tracks, can induce an opponent to revise its own calculations. The value lies not in deception for deception's sake, but in shaping incentives so that the other side acts in ways that are more favorable to your aims. Yet here the counterpoints quickly surface. Deception in diplomacy can erode trust, invite retaliation, and complicate future negotiations when partners suspect every move. The modern ethical and legal framework around diplomatic behavior insists on credibility, transparency, and at times, constraint by international law and public accountability. Sun Tzu's indirect strategies must be weighed against these normative requirements. The best diplomacy might be that which respects the long arc of legitimacy, while still leaving room for strategic ambiguity in service of peace, stability, and shared security. In sports strategy, tempo control and the exploitation of opponent weaknesses offer a vivid playground for Sun Tzu's ideas. Consider a game of basketball or football where the team that governs the tempo, how fast or slow play unfolds, exercises a form of strategic leverage that resembles indirect approach. A team can impose a tempo that yields predictable patterns, forcing the opponent to operate in a rhythm that suits the stronger team. By controlling pace, the sharper minds can extract performance windows from the opponent's fatigue, earn favorable substitutions, and create opportunities to strike where the opponent is unprepared. The principle aligns with Sun Tzu's emphasis on terrain and timing. The arena is not only the physical field but the cognitive field, the opponent's mental state, their fatigue curves, and their willingness to commit to risk. The best coaches often talk about tempo not as an element of flair, but as a discipline that reduces uncertainty and amplifies the team's strengths, which is a quintessentially indirect approach to winning. Personal life offers a more intimate field of application. Sun Tzu's ideas about knowing yourself, understanding the other, and practicing disciplined restraint can provide a vocabulary for decisions about relationships, work-life balance, and personal growth. In this domain, deception drops into a concern with transparent motives and responsible boundaries, not manipulation for its own sake. Yet there is a delicate line to tread. One can argue that in personal life the most enduring gains come from authentic signaling, clear boundaries, honest communication, and a willingness to walk away when a situation becomes untenable, while recognizing that subtlety and timing can have a place in negotiations, whether with a partner, a colleague, or a friend, about what to reveal and when. The aim becomes not to outmaneuver the other through trickery, but to shape a relational environment in which both parties can thrive, and where personal integrity remains intact even when strategic choices are difficult. As we move from application to interpretation, it is essential to recognize that Sun Tzu does not deliver a simple recipe. He offers a framework that invites ongoing interpretation, adaptation, and reflection. In modern terms, the conversation naturally moves toward game theory and signaling theory. Sun Tzu's emphasis on knowing the enemy and knowing yourself resonates with the signaling problem. How do you convey credible information to deter war, to attract cooperation, or to induce beneficial moves from others? The metaphor of the battlefield becomes a metaphor for strategic interaction in any domain. A credible commitment can serve as a signal that stabilizes expectations, reducing the probability of costly miscalculations. The misdirection that Sun Tzu condenses into a tactical art becomes in game theoretic terms a way to alter the opponent's beliefs about your future moves, thereby shaping strategic equilibria. Yet there are limits to this translation. Clausewitz, who reframed war as political action sanctioned by policy, invites a contrast that sharpens our understanding of Sun Tzu. Clausewitz's central claim, war as politics by other means, emphasizes the moral and political purposes of war, the role of national will, and the unpredictable friction of war. Sun Tzu's philosophy can converge with Clausewitz when the political objective is clear and when the cost of conflict must be minimized, but the two thinkers diverge in emphasis. Sun Tzu's art tends toward the cognitive and organizational dimensions of conflict. Clausewitz foregrounds the political logic, the uncertainty of chance, and the moral weight of decisions that cascade beyond the battlefield. The dialogue between these two perspectives helps illuminate the ethical guardrails around deception and indirect action. It suggests that even as we learn the arts of misdirection and manipulation as strategic tools, we must also reckon with the political, social, and moral climate in which such tools operate. A related cross-reference worth dwelling on is Machiavelli's prudence and power. In The Prince and his other writings, Machiavelli urges leaders to be effective, to seize opportunities, and to maintain power through prudent, often unsentimental decisions. Sun Tzu's virtue aligns with Machiavelli's realism in some respects. Both emphasize the primacy of outcomes and the importance of reading conditions correctly. But Machiavelli's philosophy tends to foreground the politician's utility and the stabilization of power, whereas Sun Tzu often foregrounds the ethical dimension of leadership in its own right, the obligation to keep the people's trust and the leader's own character as a channel for strategic effectiveness. The conversation between Sun Tzu and Machiavelli invites us to examine not just what works, but what kind of leadership makes the work sustainable. Leadership that can wield power with restraint when possible, with resolve when necessary, and with an awareness that power without legitimacy is fragile. Taoist and Confucian streams offer further texture. The Taoist tradition, with its emphasis on Wu Wei, effortless action or action in harmony with the Tao, gives a striking complement to the Sun Tzu project of shaping outcomes with minimal conflict. The idea is not to force events but to align with the natural flows of situation and chance, to respond to the opponent's moves rather than to impose one's own will in every moment. Confucian leadership ethics, by contrast, emphasizes moral cultivation, the example of the superior person, and a governance that earns the people's trust through virtue. When we place Sun Tzu against these moral frameworks, we see a nuanced triangulation. Strategy without virtue risks crass opportunism. Virtue without strategy risks paralysis. Strategy with virtue and cultural legitimacy can produce durable, peaceful orders that still harness the power of intelligent, decisive action in the face of danger. Game theory and signaling theory offer modern lenses to explore Sun Tzu's insights with mathematical clarity. Signaling through credible commitments, the idea that a state or a firm can reduce uncertainty by the signals it sends and the credibility it maintains, is a direct descendant of the kind of reasoning Sun Tzu exemplified, even if the formal model did not exist in his time. In signaling theory, the value of a credible commitment lies in its ability to deter threats and to induce the opponent to choose a course of action that benefits the signaling party. Sun Tzu's emphasis on credible signals and on the political costs of deception map neatly onto this modern vocabulary. The study of information asymmetries, cheap talk, and costly signaling illuminates why certain indirect moves succeed while others fail, and why trust, once damaged, is a difficult resource to replenish. A practical implication is that deception, while perhaps effective in the short term, can destroy the foundations of long-term collaboration and market stability if it becomes habitual or systemic. In the realm of management and organizational strategy, the Sun Tzu approach has shaped how leaders think about risk, competition, and resource allocation. Modern strategists often emphasize competitive intelligence, scenario planning, and the careful sequencing of moves to create disjunctures in a rival's plans. The art of winning without fighting has echoes in risk-averse strategies that prioritize non-escalation, price leadership, and market repositioning. It is important, however, to recognize the perils that accompany any overly aggressive reliance on deception or indirect tactics in corporate life, especially when such strategies undermine stakeholder trust, corporate governance norms, or reputational capital. A corporation that builds its value on transparent governance, clear communication, and reliable performance can pursue indirect advantages in thoughtful, ethical ways that preserve legitimacy even as it innovates in the margins. We now turn to the historical anecdotes that confirm Sun Tzu's terms as living memory and not mere abstractions. First, the use of spies in the warring states offers a window into an information ecology that Sun Tzu both described and relied upon. In a landscape of shifting loyalties and fragile alliances, intelligence networks and counterintelligence measures could determine the outcomes of campaigns more reliably than armies alone. Spies, those who might be described as the prehistoric versions of market researchers or diplomatic intelligence officers, could deliver information that reframed the costs of action, the viability of targets, and the likelihood of a rival's vulnerabilities. This networked dimension of Sun Tzu's thought shows that the art of winning is, at its core, an art of gathering, interpreting, and acting upon information with discipline and restraint. Second, the Baju deception and Wu Yue dynamics offer a striking antiquity for the indirect method. The tale, often told as a demonstration of how misdirection, feints, and the manipulation of material and psychological terrain can yield dramatic results, illustrates the leverage that deception can exert when it resonates with the broader political climate and with the opponent's own incentives. The story is not a mere parable about cleverness. It is a record of how strategic cunning, when aligned with the people's trust and with credible leadership, can shape the flow of a campaign and alter the balance of power. The Baju episode also reminds us that deception can be risky. If misread, it may provoke rash actions or retaliation, and if it undermines legitimacy, it can invite a cost that outlasts the victory itself. Third, the diffusion of Sun Tzu's ideas into Korea and Japan is a telling example of how strategic wisdom migrates and mutates as it travels across cultures and centuries. The reception of the art of war in East Asia created new strands of strategic thought, adapted to different political orders, historical contingencies, and ethical frameworks. In Korea, Japan, and beyond, Sun Tzu's maxims were integrated with local traditions of leadership and statecraft, sometimes emphasizing the military code, at other times focusing on the moral and organizational dimensions of leadership. This diffusion shows the flexibility and resilience of Sun Tzu's thought. It can be invoked to justify a disciplined, ethical governance as well as to counsel cunning and calculated risk. It also invites us to reflect on how ideas migrate, how they are reinterpreted to fit new institutional needs, and how a core set of principles can maintain a consistent logic even as their social uses vary. The cross-references Clausewitz, Machiavelli, Taoist Wu Wei, Confucian leadership ethics, signaling theory, game theory, and modern management are not footnotes but a conversation that enriches our understanding. Clausewitz invites attention to political purpose and the human costs of war, reminding us that strategic wisdom must negotiate with the moral and political order. Machiavelli poses a stern question about the prudence, legitimacy, and resilience of rulers who wield power in complex landscapes. Taoist thought challenges us to consider how to act in ways that align with natural flows rather than force outcomes through brute dominance. Confucian ethics call us to consider the character of leadership, the cultivation of virtue, and the responsibilities of rulers to care for the well-being of the people. Signaling theory and game theory provide rigorous formalisms for understanding how information, trust, and incentives shape strategic choices. Modern management and strategic thinking translate these ideas into practical tools for organizations that must navigate competitive markets, regulatory environments, and global interdependencies. In this sense, Sun Tzu's core principles become a bridge across centuries, a language that continues to be spoken in boardrooms and battlefields alike. Let us, finally, examine 2 or 3 careful case studies that illustrate both the strengths and the limits of Sun Tzu's principles in contemporary settings. The first case concerns a corporation that faced a saturated market but was not yet ready to surrender the field to incumbents with entrenched advantages. Rather than triggering a direct price war, the company invested in an intelligence-gathering program designed to map consumer needs, competitor capabilities, and regulatory trajectories. It then introduced a differentiated offering tailored to an underserved customer segment, and crucially, it formed strategic alliances that allowed it to leverage existing distribution networks while avoiding direct confrontation with the dominant players. The risk was not minimal, but the strategy reduced cost because it avoided the expensive arms race that can accompany direct competition. The project's success did not come from a spectacular defeat of rivals, but from a measured repositioning of value, a credible commitment to quality, and a disciplined approach to execution that preserved cash flow during a critical transition. A second case concerns diplomacy and negotiations that exploited credible commitments and misdirection to shape outcomes. A government negotiating a sensitive security arrangement signaled a willingness to engage in a robust verification regime while simultaneously maintaining a parallel diplomatic track to reduce the risk of overcommitting to a single path. This approach created a strategic ambiguity that forced counterparties to acknowledge their own constraints, while also preserving an exit ladder for more favorable long-term arrangements. The result was a settlement that reduced the likelihood of rapid escalation, even as it contained a degree of risk that required careful monitoring and robust verification. The lesson here is not to substitute cunning for transparency, but to understand how credible signals, carefully managed, can promote stability and reduce the costs of miscalculation. A third case in sports illustrates tempo control and exploiting opponent weaknesses. In a team sport known for its pace, the coach used data on the opponent's fatigue and substitution patterns to orchestrate sequences that forced timeouts and mismatches when the opponent was at its weakest. The plan did not rely on a single spectacular move. It depended on consistent pressure, attention to rest cycles, and strategic substitutions that preserved the team's energy for decisive moments. The result was a victory built on rhythm, not spectacle, reflecting Sun Tzu's insistence that timing and terrain can be as decisive as force of arms. These case studies also reveal the limitations of Sun Tzu's framework. In some contexts, deception can erode trust so severely that it undermines long-term relationships with customers, partners, or allies. In other contexts, the ethical and legal norms of international life, norms that have been elaborated through centuries of practice, place limits on what strategies may be considered legitimate or permissible. In still other contexts, transparency and collaboration are not only ethically required but strategically optimal. Invoking indirect means when direct cooperation would be more productive can lead to strategic deadlock or reputational damage. The art of war thus remains a delicate instrument, powerful when used in moderation, but dangerous when used without a clear understanding of the larger ethical, political, and social landscape. In closing, what Sun Tzu offers us is not a cheat sheet for triumph, but a disciplined way of thinking about conflict, competition, and cooperation. The key is to see victory not solely as the destruction of an opponent, but as the optimal alignment of purpose, resources, and time with the currents that shape events. To know yourself is to know your limits and your commitments. To know the enemy is to understand the incentives that drive their decisions and the constraints that bind them. To master deception is to recognize when signaling and perception are essential tools for reducing risk, while acknowledging that deception is not a universal solvent and can, if overused, hollow out the values that make partnerships and communities viable. The art of winning, finally, means learning to win with minimal cost when possible, and to win in a way that strengthens the conditions under which life and work can continue to prosper. As we explore these ideas, we should remain attentive to textual anchors in Sun Tzu's own words. Consider the line often translated as, "There is no instance of a nation benefiting from prolonged warfare." The sentiment is not a pacifist denial of force, but a warning about the economic and moral consequences of endless conflict. Read alongside, "Opportunities multiply as they are seized," emphasizes that a strategist must cultivate the ability to perceive favorable openings and to move with decisiveness when the moment presents itself. And the famous assertion that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting invites us to measure the cost of action against the ethical weight of the outcome. If these are to be our anchors, we must also acknowledge the ambiguities of translation. The art of war is a text in which words carry multiple shades of meaning, and the decision to emphasize one shade over another will shape how we act in practice. The different translations can illuminate or obscure certain aspects of the doctrine, and modern readers must approach with humility, recognizing that even venerable texts invite reinterpretation as the social and moral landscape changes. To appreciate the breadth of Sun Tzu's insights, we must also bring into view powerful cross-references to modern thought. Clausewitz helps us understand how political aims and moral considerations constrain strategy, while Machiavelli's prudence prompts us to weigh the costs of deception against the necessity of power. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei offers a contrasting approach that invites us to cultivate flexibility and alignment with natural conditions, while Confucian leadership ethics insists on virtue, as the source of lasting legitimacy. Game theory and signaling theory bring mathematical clarity to the dynamics of commitment, information, and strategic interaction, helping to explain when Sun Tzu's indirect methods will be robust and when they risk misinterpretation. In the realm of management, these ideas become instruments for designing organizations that can navigate uncertainty, align incentives, and maintain legitimacy while pursuing competitive advantage. The interplay of these threads, ancient wisdom and modern theory, gives Sun Tzu's core principles their enduring power and their potential for renewal in ever-new contexts. As we move toward a close for this section, let us recall the 2 or 3 essential questions that can hold a viewer's mind in a moment of pause. First, what is the appropriate balance between knowledge and deception in any given situation? Second, how do you assess the 5 factors in a particular context, and how do you ensure that your plan remains adaptable as terrain, timing, and leadership constraints shift? Third, what counts as victory in the modern world? Is it only the triumph of a plan over an opponent, or can victory also mean the preservation of life, the maintenance of trust, and the creation of conditions under which a community can endure and prosper? The art of war does not supply one final answer to these questions. It offers a map for thinking about them. The map is not a rigid road, but a set of contours that remind us to look at the frame within which decisions arise, the moral, political, and practical frame that Sun Tzu believed must guide any strategic act. In the spirit of Snooze philosophy, we invite our listeners to reflect with quiet attention rather than with dramatic certainty. Let these ideas land slowly, like the careful placement of pieces on a chessboard, where each move must be justified not only by its immediate effect, but also by its implications for the next moves, the next season, the next generation of decisions. The wisdom of Sun Tzu rests on the capacity to see patterns, to discern incentives, and to act with restraint and intention. It rests, too, on humility, the humility to acknowledge when information is incomplete, the humility to concede that deception must be used sparingly and ethically, and the humility to recognize that even the best strategy can fail in the face of a reality that refuses to yield to calculation alone. In our journey through the core principles, knowledge, deception, and the art of winning, we have traced origins, wrestled with the 5 factors, tested ideas against modern theories, listened to the echoes of historical anecdotes, and considered concrete applications. We have learned that Sun Tzu's art is not a sterile doctrine, but a living enterprise that invites us to think with discretion, to act with discernment, and to recognize that the strongest strategy may be the one that keeps lives intact, relationships intact, and the possibility of future cooperation intact. Whether we apply these lessons to policy, business, sports, or personal life, the aim remains the same: to win with purpose, with care for the commons, and with a fidelity to the ethics of leadership that can endure beyond any single skirmish. As you listen to this, consider returning to the primary lines of Sun Tzu and listening anew to the cadence of translation, the nuance of meaning, and the weight of their implications. The art of war is not a recipe for power alone, but a discipline for wise action under pressure. In the quiet of your own reading, in the tension of your own decisions, you may find that these ancient lines offer not just strategic tactics, but a form of moral and intellectual training. The aim always remains to understand, to adapt, and to act in a way that reduces unnecessary harm while preserving the possibility of peace, collaboration, and flourishing for all who are part of the arena of human life. This is Sun Tzu's enduring invitation to think deeply about how we win, what counts as victory, and how to do so in a way that makes the world more livable for those who remain after the fighting ends. Imagine a calm morning where every decision you make feels like a small strategic ripple that could become a wave. In this space, Sun Tzu steps in not as a dusty relic of ancient battlefields, but as a living set of questions and tools you can apply to leadership, organizations, negotiations, and everyday choices. Sun Tzu invites us to slow down, observe, and deliberate before we act. He invites us to translate the language of armies into the language of teams, markets, networks, and digital environments. He asks us to consider not just how to win, but how to win with less waste, how to influence the unfolding of events so that outcomes align with a clearer intention, a more capable posture, and a more responsive context. In this section, we'll translate Sun Tzu into practical frameworks that you can reuse day after day in meetings, negotiations, project runs, and crises. To begin with the roots, where Sun Tzu came from and why his voice travels beyond the scrolls of the battlefield. Sun Tzu, often rendered as Master Sun, is said to have lived in the late spring and autumn period and into the early warring states, a time when states carved themselves into confederations and the forces of power shifted with each sunrise. The exact details of his life are debated, lineages blur, biographies vary, and the historical record filters through the lens of later historians who both mythologize and rely on fragments. Yet the core is not a person's biography, but a set of claims about how conflict emerges and how it can be steered. The art of war, often attributed in its verses to a single strategist, is more accurately a compendium of strategic wisdom that circulated, was taught, refined, and reframed across generations. It was compiled into a coherent whole at a time when the Chinese state system valued order, flexible mobilization, layered information, and the discipline of planning. Sun Tzu's world imagined war not simply as a contest of arms, but as a contest of information, perception, and timing. The central premise, warfare is based on deception, presents a paradox for modern readers who value transparency and trust. Yet what Sun Tzu is really inviting us to notice is that in any high-stakes environment, information, timing, and perception shape outcomes as powerfully as raw force. To translate this into leadership and organizational practice is to move from battlefield tactics to the terrains of negotiation rooms, boardroom tableaus, and crisis command centers, where people must decide under uncertainty, align competing interests, and keep their organizations resilient when the environment shifts abruptly. Let's begin with the core questions that anchor Sun Tzu's thought and that we will translate into practical frameworks for leadership, organization, and everyday strategy. Consider the strategic triangle. Intention, capability, environment. Think of it as three legs of a stool that must align for stability and momentum. Intention is what you want to achieve, the aim, the principle, the desired end state. Capability is what you can deploy: resources, skills, processes, technologies, relationships. Environment is the broader setting, the market dynamics, regulatory landscape, cultural norms, interdependencies, and the tempo of change. Sun Tzu would remind us that success rests less on sheer force and more on aligning these three elements so that they reinforce each other, so that your plan is plausible, and so that you do not overextend or misread the field. We'll unpack this through a set of interconnected frameworks designed for practical daily use. Adaptive planning, risk management aligned with intention and environment, and a diagnostic routine you can run before every major decision. We'll also weave in cross-references to game theory and negotiation literature. Think Fisher and Urey, leadership psychology, emotional intelligence and social cognition, and operations research, risk modeling and optimization, so you can see how Sun Tzu intersects with modern strands of thought. The goal is not to imitate ancient war, but to adopt a way of thinking that clarifies choice, reduces waste, and preserves ethical guardrails as you navigate complex systems. First, a precise articulation of the strategic triangle and the accompanying routines. The strategic triangle has three vertices: intention, capability, and environment. Intention answers the question, what is the purpose? It's not merely what you want to accomplish, but why you want it and for whom. You can articulate intention as a principled aim, a value-driven North Star that does not become a brittle mandate but a living guide that can be adjusted in light of new information. Capability answers the question, what can you actually do? This includes people, processes, technology, networks, and the capacity to deploy them. Environment answers the question, what is possible here now given competing interests, constraints, and the tempo of change? The environment includes competitors, allies, customers, regulators, cultural norms, and the physical or digital networks in which you operate. Sun Tzu's teaching that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting suggests something deeply relevant to leadership and organizational life beyond literal warfare. The optimal path is to shape perception, align interests, and reduce antagonism before a clash becomes necessary. In modern terms, that translates into shaping the narrative, building coalitions, creating options for all parties, and using information and timing to avoid costly confrontations. The aim is not to erase conflict, but to manage it with minimal harm and maximal alignment with your higher purposes. With this in mind, let us build a practical, repeatable process you can apply in leadership, management, negotiations, and crisis scenarios. We'll present a diagnostic routine you can perform in a structured way, a planning cadence that remains flexible, and a decision template that helps you stay anchored while you adapt. Diagnostic routine. Diagnose the environment, map enemies and allies, align resources, anticipate change, and adapt. The routine begins with a calm, disciplined observation. What is happening right now? Where is the pressure coming from? Who benefits from the current design of rules and incentives? Who is left out? In the spirit of Sun Tzu, we begin with information, not to manipulate, but to illuminate. The goal is to form a clear hypothesis about the environment. How do the power dynamics look? What are the hidden constraints that insiders know, but outsiders tend to overlook? What is the tempo of change? Are you in a phase of acceleration, stabilization, or disruption? Next, map enemies and allies, not as moral binaries, but as networks of influence and interest. Enemies are not necessarily people you hate. They are forces that oppose your intended end state or threaten misalignment with your core values. Allies are those who can amplify your intention, provide complementary capabilities, or offer legitimacy to your approach. The mapping should include both formal and informal power structures: who sits at the table, who has access to information, who sets the agenda, and who can shift the frame of the conversation. In practical terms, develop a stakeholder map that includes the decision makers, the influencers, the gatekeepers, the customers, the regulators, and the technical experts whose work will enable or obstruct your plan. Also map the adversary's potential levers. Where might they constrain you? What incentives could they resist? What vulnerabilities can you anticipate? And what leverage points could you exploit ethically to align outcomes with your aims? Then come the resource alignment step. Sun Tzu would remind us to consider not only what you possess, but how you deploy it to maximum effect. Do you have sufficient time, capital, talent, trust, and information to support your plan? Are there bottlenecks that would cause a plan to stall? The alignment step asks you to compress decision cycles where possible and to ensure that the organization's structure, incentives, and governance reflect the intended course. This is where the concept of fit in the strategic triangle becomes visible. Your intention must be plausible given the capabilities you can mobilize and the environment you must operate within. If the environment is too volatile or the capabilities insufficient, you either recalibrate the intention or build the missing capabilities, or you seek a change in the environment by reframing the problem or persuading others to join a new coalition. Anticipate change. Sun Tzu's emphasis on knowing the terrain and anticipating the moves of rivals translates in modern terms to scenario planning, real options thinking, and decision trees that accommodate uncertainty. It's not enough to forecast one outcome. You need a set of plausible futures and the triggers that would move you from one to another. Use premortems, outline how a plan could fail, and examine the early indicators that would reveal those failure modes. Build a palette of responses that range from modest adjustments to bold pivots, and assign decision rights and thresholds for each. This anticipatory layer keeps you from being trapped by a single plan when the environment refuses to stay still. Adapt. The central claim of Sun Tzu's strategic practice is not rigid adherence to a plan, but the capacity to adjust to shifting circumstances with grace and speed. Adaptation requires culture, muscles, and rituals that support quick learning, a debrief after each milestone, a readiness to reassign talents, a preference for modular, scalable tactics over brittle, monolithic programs. It means you keep your core intention intact while reconfiguring your means to meet the terrain. Adaptation is not a sign of weakness, it is intelligence under pressure. Now let's translate these steps into concrete templates and templates you can adapt to daily life. First, the strategic triangle template. Write it like this: intention. What is the overarching aim? Why this aim? For whom? What are the ethical guardrails that will govern your actions? What does success look like in human terms? What is the benefit to people, not just to numbers? Capability. What assets do you truly have? What are your people's skills, your processes, your relationships, your data, your technology stack, your supply lines, your reputational capital? What are your constraints? What do you know and what do you not know? Environment. What is the current landscape, market dynamics, competitive moves, regulatory shifts, cultural currents, external shocks on the horizon? What are the hidden rules that govern how decisions are made, who gets listened to, and how power flows? Then a set of readiness questions for the team or yourself. What could derail our plan, and what would be early warning signs? Who in our network can we align to broaden the envelope of feasible options? What is the minimum viable action that could prove as a stepping stone toward the intended outcome? How can we create options for opposing stakeholders so that a concession becomes a strategic win for the overall aim? Second, the adaptive planning cadence, a simple rhythm you can embed. Week 1, diagnose and map, revisit environment and stakeholder map, verify data, check assumptions. Week 2, align and commit, confirm resource commitments. Align incentives, set decision thresholds, publish a lightweight plan that is modular and revisable. Week 3, execute a pilot or a controlled experiment that tests core assumptions in a safe, contained environment. Week 4, review and revise, debrief with a diversified group, extract learning, update the plan and the thresholds. Then repeat in cycles, allowing the plan to evolve while the core intention remains visible. Third, the risk management framework inspired by Sun Tzu's emphasis on knowing the terrain and the tempo. Think of risk management as 3 layers. Threat identification. What are the known threats and unknowns? Use structured brainstorming with diverse voices to surface biases and blind spots. Exposure and impact. What happens if a threat materializes? What is the potential harm to people, mission, and sustainability? Mitigation and contingency. What steps reduce exposure? What efficient mindsets and processes will permit rapid recovery? Within this framework, you can build a simple risk matrix that maps likelihood against impact, but with a twist. Overlay the strategic triangle. Some risks will threaten your environment, market shifts, policy changes. Others threaten capability, talent attrition, technology failures. Still others threaten intention, misalignment of purpose with strategy, ethical breaches. Assign to each risk an owner, a trigger, a response plan, and a fallback option that preserves human safety and organizational about-face when needed. Now let's bring this into real-world modes of practice through a set of richly described case studies that illustrate how the sunlit core of Sun Tzu's thinking translates into concrete actions. We'll do 4 case studies, each anchored in a different realm: corporate strategy, negotiation tactics, crisis management, and cybersecurity information warfare. Each case will present a diagnostic, a plan, a sequence of actions, and a reflective debrief, plus the ethical guardrails that must govern every step. Case Study 1. Corporate strategy that aligns supply chains and market entry to avoid overextension. Imagine a multinational manufacturing firm facing a disruptive supplier network and a shifting demand landscape. The leadership team uses the strategic triangle to frame a plan. Intention: to stabilize and progressively expand profitable markets while preserving core competencies and maintaining financial resilience. They insist on a value-driven aim: protect the livelihoods of their workers and the integrity of the supply chain while delivering sustainable shareholder value and dependable product quality. Capability: the firm inventories its supplier relationships, its production capacities, its geographic diversification, its logistics partnerships, and its data analytics capabilities. They map the supply chain nodes, identify single points of failure, and assess the resilience of distribution routes. Environment: the team maps regulatory regimes, trade tensions, and the evolving demands of customers, plus the ripple effects of climate risk on transport and manufacturing. They map not only direct competitors, but also alternative providers of product substitutes and the emergent platforms that could rearrange distribution channels. The plan unfolds in incremental steps designed to prevent overextension. First, they create a portfolio approach to market entry that prioritizes adjacent markets with shared regulatory ecosystems, similar consumer preferences, and interdependent supplier networks. They avoid pushing into new geographies where supply chain complexity would balloon without a commensurate increase in demand, or where the regulatory apparatus would require heavy, unpredictable investments. They implement a test and leverage model: pilot production in a lower-risk region with scalable capacity, while maintaining core manufacturing in familiar territories. They negotiate long-term pricing and capacity commitments with suppliers in exchange for greater predictability, thereby reducing the risk of price volatility and disruptions due to supplier shocks. Second, they map allies and potential adversaries in the market environment. Allies include suppliers who can provide flexibility and alternative routing options, logistics partners who can reallocate shipments quickly, distributors who can help penetrate new markets, and the local teams who understand regulatory nuance. Adversaries may include competitor incumbents, sometimes with better established distribution networks in the target markets, and political actors or trade groups who could complicate entry. They design a coalition plan that aligns incentives across these actors, sharing forecast data to reduce bullwhip effects, co-investing in local capacity, or obtaining favorable regulatory exemptions through joint demonstrations of safety and sustainability. Third, they align resources with clear guardrails. They set investment caps for each market entry, tie resource commitments to quarterly milestones, and embed a clear decision gate that requires a favorable test result in at least 2 of 3 plausible futures. They implement robust financial planning with scenario-based budgeting that stresses supply disruption and demand swings. They embed environmental, social, and governance (ESG) criteria into supplier selection to ensure resilience aligns with ethical commitments, reducing incentives to pursue exploitative or hidden risk suppliers. Fourth, they anticipate change and design adaptive responses. They hold quarterly strategy reviews that examine external signals, price shifts, policy changes, competitor network reorganizations, and environmental risk indicators. They maintain a small set of strategic options: A. Shielded expansion where markets are stable. B. Delayed entry with greater capacity building. C. Pivot to alternative offerings if core products lose competitiveness. D. Geostrategic reallocation of capital if macro changes demand it. Finally, they adapt through a rapid learning loop. When a disruption occurs, perhaps a supplier slowdown due to a regional storm or a regulatory delay, the team shifts its plan quickly, reassigning production and adjusting pricing to maintain service levels while preserving margins. They learn from the experience by running after-action reviews that are honest and rigorous, revisiting the assumptions that supported the plan, and updating the management playbook accordingly. The ethical guardrails come into sharp relief here. Transparency with employees and communities affected by supply chain changes, avoidance of deceptive bargaining tactics with suppliers, fair treatment of workers across geographies, and an insistence on safe, sustainable practices that do not compromise safety or long-term viability for short-term gains. Case Study 2. Negotiation tactics that frame concessions and manage expectations. Sun Tzu's appear weak when you are strong and strong when you are weak can be distilled into a disciplined posture in negotiation, one that lifelike negotiators can practice without falling into cynical games. The scenario is a high-stakes supplier contract negotiation in which your organization needs favorable terms but wants to preserve the long-running relationship with the vendor. The strategic triangle remains the guide. Your intention is not merely to obtain a lower price but to secure reliable supply, predictable performance, and a collaborative relationship that advances both sides' strategic aims. Your capability includes your own sourcing team, data about price elasticity, a robust risk management framework that can quantify supply risk, and your legal team that can craft terms that preserve flexibility. The environment includes the vendor's cost structure, their revenue targets, the competitive bidding landscape, and external market conditions such as currency fluctuations and commodity prices. The preparation step emphasizes knowing your own position and the opponent's interests. You should collect hard data on price-to-performance trade-offs, your minimum acceptable terms, your walk-away point, and the strategic value of the relationship to your organization. You should also consider the counterpart's likely constraints and incentives, not merely their stated demands. This is where the concept of integrative bargaining, a term from Fisher and Urey's Getting to Yes, meets Sun Tzu's thinking. The aim is not to squeeze concessions, but to create value and expand the pie in ways that are visible and verifiable to both sides. You prepare a menu of concessions and counteroffers, each with a rationale anchored in objective criteria, so that when you present your options, you are not just reacting to pressure, but steering the rhythm of the negotiation toward outcomes that are sustainable. In the negotiation, you begin with a posture that signals seriousness and openness. You do not reveal your all at once. You stage your information in increments, beginning with a strong but credible position. You present your case with the logic of a well-structured argument, what you need, why you need it, and what you are offering in return. When the other side offers a concession, you acknowledge it and then deploy a counteroffer that recenters the discussion on joint value creation rather than simply reducing price. The Sun Tzu insight about deception is here reframed as strategic framing and information control. You provide enough information to build trust while withholding strategic levers that could derail you if revealed prematurely. An important practice is to map the concession currency, the units of value that your counterpart values and that you can offer without undermining your essential needs. For some vendors, it is price. For others, it is delivery certainty, risk sharing, or longer contract commitments that secure revenue flows. For your part, you may be able to trade in speed to market, preferential payment terms, co-development opportunities, or access to data and insights that allow you to tune the relationship for mutual advantage. Through this lens, concessions are not losses but strategic investments in shared outcomes. Ethical guardrails come into sharp focus in negotiation because they test your commitment to trust and fairness. You must avoid coercive tactics that exploit information asymmetries in ways that harm the other party or create long-term reputation risks. You should avoid deception as a tactic that erodes trust and triggers costly enforcement or regulatory responses. The goal is to build durable relationships that can withstand shocks, not to win a single battle at the cost of future cooperation. If the negotiation reveals a fundamental misalignment of core values, e.g., if the vendor requires practices that violate your company's ethical standards, you must exit the negotiation gracefully or pursue alternatives that preserve your integrity. Case Study 3. Crisis Management and Rapid Decision Making in Technology Firms or Government Agencies. In this scenario, an organization faces a sudden, high-stakes event. A data breach with potential national security implications or a critical system failure during a peak operational period. The Sun Tzu-inspired approach here is to use the diagnostic routines to stabilize the situation, protect people, and maintain critical operations while you learn and adapt in real time. First, diagnose and stabilize. The incident response team must rapidly gather facts. What happened? When did it occur? How widespread is the impact? And who needs to be informed immediately? They must also triage the harm to users, clients, citizens, or stakeholders, and implement containment measures to limit further damage. This step embodies the Sun Tzu emphasis on speed and control over the field of engagement. You do not want chaos to govern the situation. You want a clear picture of the terrain and an anchored objective: containment, protection of sensitive data, and rapid restoration of service. Second, map the ecosystem of impact. Who are the internal and external stakeholders that must be engaged? Who has access to relevant data and who needs to be kept informed? Which partners or vendors are implicated, and what are their responsibilities under the incident response plan and any contractual obligations? You build a map of the network of influence, including regulators who may require disclosure, customers who demand transparency, and executives who must authorize decisions. Third, align resources under time pressure. In such moments, the decision triangle must respond with a lean, modular structure. The team must deploy the necessary resources quickly: the cybersecurity team to investigate, the legal and communications teams to craft accurate and compliant disclosures, the product teams to implement patchwork fixes or redaction, and the IT operations teams to maintain reliability. The environment here is a crucible, fast, volatile, and evolving by the minute. The plan must be built with a cadence that respects both speed and accountability. Fourth, anticipate change and adapt. An escalation in severity or new evidence about the breach can alter the entire plan. The organization must be prepared to switch gears, perhaps pivot to a forensics-driven recovery, shift to a more aggressive public disclosure strategy, or reframe the risk management posture for ongoing monitoring and remediation. The Sun Tzu principle of adaptation is essential here. The team must be ready to pivot, not to cling to a plan that no longer fits reality. Fifth, practice ethical guardrails in crisis. The stakes of crisis management include user safety, privacy, security, and trust. Transparent, accurate communication is critical. The organization must avoid sensationalism, avoid misrepresenting data, and ensure that any disclosures comply with legal and ethical norms. The leadership must balance the obligation to inform with the obligation to protect sensitive information that could cause further harm if revealed prematurely. In crisis, as in battle, deception should be tempered with responsibility. The goal is to resolve the situation with dignity, accountability, and the least possible harm. Case Study 4. Cybersecurity and Information Warfare Contexts that Blend Defense with Deception. The digital landscape is a battlefield of ideas, data, and influence operations. Sun Tzu's lessons on deception, intelligence gathering, and terrain awareness translate with a twist into security strategy and threat intelligence. The strategic triangle here works at two levels: defense of critical assets and the strategic use of deception or misdirection to confuse or mislead potential attackers, while remaining firmly anchored in ethical and legal constraints. Intention in cybersecurity may be framed as safeguarding the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and systems, while maintaining a user-centered approach to privacy and rights. Capability includes the security architecture, threat intel capabilities, incident response, penetration testing, red teaming, and the cultural discipline of secure by default. Environment includes the threat landscape, regulatory requirements, industry norms, and the evolving tempo of cyberattacks, supply chain compromises, and misinformation campaigns. A practical approach inspired by Sun Tzu blends defensive posture with strategic misdirection. A modest form of deception in cybersecurity involves decoys, honeypots, and misinformation to mislead attackers without compromising user trust or exposing real assets. It also involves shaping the attacker's perception. By presenting a resilient defense, you raise the cost for the attacker to continue and increase the probability that they will abandon the attempt or pivot to easier targets. But the deployment of deception must be balanced against legal norms, ethical obligations, and the risk of misinterpretation that could harm legitimate users or allies. In practice, a durable information security strategy uses Sun Tzu's emphasis on terrain and timing to inform defensive architecture. You map the terrain of your network, the assets, the data flows, the dependencies, and the interfaces between systems that attackers are most likely to exploit. You then examine the enemy and ally map in information terms. Who are the likely adversaries, crime syndicates, state-sponsored actors, insider threats, who can assist you, security analytics vendors, incident response partners, open-source intelligence communities, and which stakeholders must be kept informed, customers, board, regulators. You plan response playbooks that can be executed rapidly, containment, eradication, recovery, and communications, so that you can win without fighting where possible, or at least reduce the damage of the inevitable skirmishes in cyberspace. In this domain, the roles of ethics and law become even more central. The temptation to use aggressive, offensive tools must be tempered by legal restrictions, international norms, and the potential to escalate conflicts or undermine trust in critical digital infrastructures. The guardrails thus require a clear mandate for lawful, proportionate, and responsible actions, with explicit oversight and accountability. Throughout these cases, we see that the practical Sun Tzu-inspired framework is not a call to reflexive warfare. It is a discipline of aligning intention, capability, and environment with a readiness to adapt. It's about turning strategic questions into concrete, repeatable routines that can be taught, practiced, and refined. A note on the real-world adoption and the tensions that emerge. Sun Tzu's ideas have traveled across centuries and cultures, becoming a kind of strategic vocabulary used by executives, military leaders, and policymakers. In the West, the text has been paired with and sometimes contrasted against ideas from Clausewitz, who emphasized the political nature of war and the uncertainties of war's moral dimension. Machiavelli, who focused on political acumen, cunning, and governance, and modern game theory scholars who analyze strategic interaction under rational choice assumptions. This cross-pollination produces nuanced insights. Game theory adds formality to the study of strategic interaction, while psychological insights into emotion, bias, and social dynamics illuminate how people actually behave under stress. The teachings of Fisher and Ari on negotiation remind us to separate positions from interests and to search for integrative solutions rather than zero-sum bargains. Leadership psychology, especially the study of emotional intelligence, helps us understand how leadership presence, empathy, and social awareness influence the reception of strategy and the ability to mobilize a team behind it. Operations research provides tools for optimizing resource allocation and scheduling under constraints, aligning with Sun Tzu's insistence on efficiency and predictability in the face of uncertainty. And ethics and ever-pressing consideration keeps the application of Sun Tzu's ideas grounded in humane and lawful conduct. Here are some direct cross-references you can keep in mind as you study and apply Sun Tzu in practice. To game theory and negotiation literature, see how the integration of intention and payoff structures in cooperative games mirrors the strategic triangle. Fisher and Ari's framework for principled negotiation aligns with an intention-driven approach that seeks to expand value rather than simply claim it. In Sun Tzu's terms, you aim to subdue the enemy without excessive fighting by creating landscapes where cooperation yields better outcomes than conflict. To leadership psychology, Sun Tzu's emphasis on awareness, judgment, and discipline resonates with the importance of emotional intelligence, recognizing your own emotions and those of others, identifying stress responses, and maintaining composure under pressure. The ability to communicate a clear intention, to listen to stakeholders, and to adapt without panic is central to both Sun Tzu's approach and modern leadership practice. To operations research and risk management, the ideas of optimization, scenario planning, and robust decision-making complement Sun Tzu's call to anticipate change and to align capabilities with environmental demands. The emphasis on data-informed decisions, probabilistic thinking, and contingency planning echoes Sun Tzu's insistence on the disciplined planning that precedes any action. To ethics, Sun Tzu's quiet insistence on cunning and perception must be tempered by ethical norms. The moral dimension of leadership and strategy calls for responsibilities to employees, customers, communities, and broader societal norms. The aim is to use strategic insight to reduce harm, preserve human dignity, and create sustainable value. Now, a set of practical daily templates you can adapt for daily life as well as organizational life. Template 1. The daily strategic ritual. Each day, spend 15-20 minutes in a quiet space to answer 4 questions. What is my intention for today? What matters most and why? What ethical guardrails guide this day's actions? What is the environment I am navigating? What signals tell me how it is changing? What trusted sources will I consult? Who are my allies and potential adversaries in this situation? Where can I strengthen alliances? How can I minimize friction with those who oppose me? What is the minimum viable action I can take that would move me toward my intention without overextending? What adjustment would I make if new information arrives? The outcomes of this ritual are an actionable plan for the day and a quick mental map to ground decisions in the strategic triangle rather than reactive impulse. Template 2. The concession cartography for negotiations. Create a two-page map that you can fill out before a negotiation. Page 1, your position and your concession currency. List your top 3 concessions that you would be willing to trade, with clear rationales rooted in objective metrics. Page 2, the counterpart's likely concessions and their value drivers. List the counterpart's likely wants and what you could offer in return that preserves your core objectives. Then add a matrix that specifies if a concession is accepted, what is the new minimum objective for the next round, and who must approve. This map helps avoid hasty compromises and keeps negotiation outcomes anchored to the sought-after end state, not to a pressure moment. Template 3, the crisis playbook for teams. Build a lightweight playbook with 4 core playbooks. Containment, what are the immediate steps to limit damage? Who is responsible for what data, what communications are required, and which metrics will determine that containment has succeeded. Stabilization, what must be recovered first, which services must come back online in what order and what dependencies exist. Recovery, what is the plan to return to a steady state? How will you upgrade defenses to prevent recurrence? Communications, who speaks to whom, when, and what is said? How will you ensure accurate, timely, and ethical disclosure? Each playbook includes decision thresholds, roles, and a post-incident review process to capture lessons learned. Template 4, the ethical guardrail matrix. For any strategic action, run a 2-axis analysis. Axis 1, potential harm to people and the environment, low, medium, high. Axis 2, legal and ethical alignment, fully compliant, compliant with caveats, questionable, clearly unethical. For each proposed action, plot where it sits and ask, is the action acceptable at this level of potential harm? If not, how can you adjust to reduce harm while preserving necessary strategic aims? Is there an alternative action with lower harm and similar value? We've looked at 4 different contexts to see how Sun Tzu's lessons can be lived today. Corporate strategy, negotiation, crisis management, and cybersecurity. There are, of course, counterarguments to adopting a Sun Tzu-inspired framework wholesale in modern organizations. Let's name and address at least 2 of them so you have a fuller view of the terrain. First, transparency and stakeholder trust can clash with secrecy or deceptive tactics that Sun Tzu's language sometimes invites in its more literal readings. While deception in Sun Tzu's sense is a strategic tool, modern organizations operate under a web of laws, norms, and expectations that require openness and accountability. The counterargument is that trust, transparency, and legitimacy are strategic assets in their own right. If you consistently hide information or manipulate perceptions through covert strategies, you risk eroding trust, betraying customers, and inviting regulatory or reputational harm that far outweighs any short-term gain from deceit. The response is to reframe deception as a protective code rather than a weapon. Use selective information sharing to protect people and critical capabilities while maintaining a transparent narrative that respects stakeholders' rights and fosters long-term trust. The cross-section of ethics and strategic thinking suggests that deception should only be used in ways that do not occlude responsible governance, human rights, or safety. In practice, this means clear ethical guardrails, oversight, and accountability mechanisms built into every Sun Tzu-inspired play. Second, over-reliance on secrecy and aggressive tactics may backfire in complex, interconnected systems. In today's world, organizations are part of global value chains, digital ecosystems, and social networks in which information travels fast and reputational cascades can be rapid. The risk is that aggressive, win-lose tactics become self-defeating as partners, employees, and customers push back, build alternative value networks, or demand greater transparency. Sun Tzu's wisdom about exploiting the terrain should be tempered by an appreciation of systemic complexity and the role of trust as a strategic asset. The way forward is to blend Sun Tzu's strategic clarity with a commitment to inclusive decision-making, stakeholder engagement, and a culture that values ethical leadership. You can still use deception as a tool in a controlled, ethical manner, only now you must ensure that the broader system's trust and legal requirements are not violated, and you must be prepared for the consequences if trust is damaged. A third critique, ethical constraints and legal norms require careful handling. In an era of heightened attention to human rights, data protection, and corporate social responsibility, any framework that could be interpreted as endorsing opportunistic exploitation must be framed explicitly within ethical and legal boundaries. This means that the Sun Tzu-inspired approach should be bound by a strong moral compass, anchored in measurable commitments to human welfare, fairness, and legal compliance. In practice, you embed ethics in every step. You establish clear guidelines for how you treat employees and contractors. You audit supply chains for compliance with labor and environmental standards. You integrate data governance practices that protect privacy and maintain transparency with users. The aim is to retain strategic effectiveness while ensuring that your actions do not undermine the principles you hold. A final counterargument concerns the risk that simplistic war analogies may misrepresent nonviolent conflict resolution. Sun Tzu's language carries battlefield imagery that can unintentionally lead organizations to reduce conflict to fighting or domination, rather than addressing underlying causes and pursuing win-win outcomes. The remedy is to translate Sun Tzu's ideas into a broader philosophy that emphasizes conflict prevention, reconciliation, and the cultivation of shared value. The frameworks we've described, strategic triangle, adaptive planning, and risk management, are intended to be used to reduce harm, increase clarity, and build resilience, not to justify coercive or violent tactics in human relations. In practice, this means embracing negotiation, mediation, restorative justice, and collaborative problem-solving as essential complements to Sun Tzu-inspired tactical planning. To deepen the historical sense and to ground these ideas in lived contexts, we should recall a few historical anecdotes that illustrate how these principles have echoed in real-world practice. First, consider Sengoku-era Japanese daimyo who sought to consolidate power in a milieu of constant conflict, shifting alliances, and rapid changes in fortune. Although Sun Tzu predated many of the most famous Sengoku campaigns, his influence traveled through intellectual and strategic circles in East Asia. The daimyo learned to balance strength with strategic patience, to read rivals' moves, to exploit disruption, and to maintain the flexibility of their own networks. They understood that victory could be achieved not through spectacular battles alone, but through the precise orchestration of alliances, diplomacy, supply lines, and local governance. This is Sun Tzu's practical invitation to leadership. To govern and to win across multiple fronts, not in a single clash, but across the entire theater of action. Second, consider Ming and Qing governance that drew on strategic culture associated with Sun Tzu. The Ming and Qing dynasties faced internal revolts, border threats, and the need to balance centralized authority with local governance. Strategic culture, a living tradition of studying and applying strategic thought, helped rulers interpret threats, allocate resources, and design political and military structures that could adapt to changing conditions. The application of strategic thinking to governance, how to maintain legitimacy, how to deploy forces, how to manage civil action and the economy, illustrates Sun Tzu's broader claim that victory arises from a well-organized system where intention, capability, and environment are aligned. The strategic question in governance is not only how to win a war, but how to sustain a state's stability and well-being while navigating complex political webs. A few more echoes in the modern world show how Sun Tzu continues to exert influence. Contemporary corporations frequently cite Sun Tzu in strategy workshops, leadership development programs, and executive education. The Art of War's emphasis on awareness, alignment, and disciplined action resonates with the modern emphasis on strategic agility, resilience, and ethical governance. In media and public policy, Sun Tzu's ideas circulate through the language of strategic risk, scenario planning, and resilience building, an embodiment of how ancient thought can travel into present, tangible practices. And in the realm of technology and cyber operations, the blend of defense with deception, the careful management of information, and the emphasis on anticipating the opponent's moves exemplify how Sun Tzu's insights have evolved in the digital era. Let's pause to connect Sun Tzu's teachings to major themes in modern strategic thought you're likely to encounter in your studies or professional life. Sun Tzu is often placed in cross-cultural dialogue with Clausewitz, who reminds us that war is political and that uncertainty is a constant. Sun Tzu, in contrast, begins with perception, information, and timing as the leverage by which political aims may be pursued or restrained. That is not to say Sun Tzu's approach is apolitical or amoral. It is a call for intelligent action that recognizes power dynamics, information asymmetries, and the fragility of plans in uncertain environments. It is also a call to act with moral seriousness, to avoid unnecessary violence, to minimize harm, and to safeguard the broader human context in which decisions are made. Now, to bring this even more alive, let me offer you a few short quotes from primary sources that you can weave into your own practice or teaching. Sun Tzu writes, "All warfare is based on deception. This line is not a license to manipulate people in harmful ways, but a reminder that perception matters, and that strategic advantage often arises from the ability to influence how others interpret the situation." He also reminds us, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. This is an invitation to rigorous self-awareness, an ongoing practice of learning about your own capabilities, limitations, biases, and the ethical commitments that guide you. And the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The sense here is not a call to pacifism, but a deep insistence on solving conflicts by shaping conditions, aligning incentives, and reducing the necessity for confrontation. We must also emphasize, as a historian of ideas, that no single text can capture the entire truth about conflict, strategy, or leadership. Sun Tzu provides a framework, an invitation to think in terms of relationships, dynamics, and timing. The real lesson is how to adapt that framework to the moral and legal norms that govern our modern world, while maintaining a clear sense of purpose and a disciplined method for action. The check on raw tactical cunning is the demand for accountability, fairness, and the protection of human well-being. The check on moralizing is to apply strategy in ways that create durable value for workers, customers, communities, and stakeholders, without sacrificing the essential dignity of those affected by decisions. To summarize what we've covered and connect back to the practical path you can implement starting today, Sun Tzu's origins remind us of a time when strategy was first recognized as a discipline, not a natural talent. The core arguments urge us to pay attention to perception, timing, and resource alignment, and to accept that adaptability is a virtue, not a sign of weakness but a sign of strength. The frameworks we've built, the strategic triangle, adaptive planning, and risk management, provide a practical language for diagnosing environments, mapping influences, and guiding decisions under pressure. The real-world applications span corporate strategy, negotiation, crisis management, and cybersecurity. They offer step-by-step playbooks, checklists, and ethical guardrails designed to help you act with clarity and integrity. The counterarguments remind us to guard against misreadings and misuse, to avoid the seduction of secrecy when transparency and trust are essential, and to keep ethics front and center. Historical anecdotes give texture to these ideas, showing how strategic thinking has shaped governance and enterprise across centuries. And the cross-references to game theory, negotiation literature, leadership psychology, and risk management show that Sun Tzu's ideas can be integrated with modern scholarship to yield richer, more robust practice. As you move forward with this material, I invite you to carry two practical commitments with you. First, cultivate the habit of reflection before action. Before a major decision or negotiation, spend a few minutes with the strategic triangle. Articulate your intention, inventory your capabilities, and scan the environment for shifts in the terrain. Then, write down the minimum viable action you can take that will preserve your core aim while remaining adaptable to new information. Second, institutionalize ethical guardrails. In any plan, be explicit about values, legal obligations, and the potential harm to people. Build a culture that prizes transparency where appropriate, accountability for decisions, and continuous learning from mistakes. The aim is not to win at any cost, but to win in a way that preserves trust, dignity, and long-term viability. If you'd like to take this further, you can combine the templates with your existing decision processes. For example, incorporate the strategic triangle into quarterly planning sessions, alongside risk assessments and scenario planning. Use the daily strategic ritual to keep decision-making sharp and aligned with your core purpose. Integrate the concession cartography into negotiation prep with suppliers, partners, or even internal stakeholders. Create a crisis playbook that aligns with your organization's risk appetite and governance framework. And embed the ethical guardrail matrix into project charters and performance reviews so that teams internalize ethics as a core driver of strategy, not an add-on. In closing, Sun Tzu keeps teaching us that leadership, organization, and strategy are not about one grand move or a single victory. They are about disciplined attention to the terrain, intelligent use of resources, and the capacity to adjust to changing circumstances while remaining true to a principled end. The quiet strategist, the snooze philosopher in you or me, learns to slow down long enough to hear the environment, to listen to the voices of allies and even adversaries, to map out the possible futures, and to act with clarity, care, and constitutional restraint. The practice is not glamorous in the moment but profoundly effective over time, a steady, humane, and resilient way to navigate a world of constant change. And so I invite you to carry Sun Tzu into your daily life not as a war manual, but as a living method to sustain leadership, collaboration, and ethical decision-making in the face of complexity. Use the frameworks, hold the guardrails, honor the historical lessons, and be prepared to adapt when the terrain shifts. If you do, you'll find that Sun Tzu's wisdom becomes not a weapon but a compass, one that helps you steer through the storms of modern life with composure, foresight, and a deep regard for the people affected by your choices. Sun Tzu's The Art of War has long trudged through seminars, boardrooms, and policy briefings as a compact manual on strategy. But in this section, we turn the lens inward, not to applaud it as a timeless blueprint for victory, but to interrogate its claims, its origins, and the ethical terrain it navigates. We will ask how authentic these texts are, how old they really are, how translations shape the meanings we extract, and how different cultures have received and repurposed Sun Tzu across centuries. We will test the promises Sun Tzu is said to offer: speed, efficiency, prudence, leverage, and we will weigh them against the costs and risks that come with applying such ideas in a world of imperfect knowledge, moral complexity, and shared interdependence. And we will look with humility at how Sun Tzu continues to influence policy, business, and culture, while also demanding careful, context-sensitive interpretation that centers ethics and human flourishing rather than mere wins in a cold calculus of power. Let us begin with the question of authenticity in dating, a matter not of mere trivia, but of what counts as knowledge in political philosophy and strategic thought. The Art of War is presented to readers as a text of ancient Chinese wisdom, and within its own frames it positions itself as a distilled synthesis of military insight passed down through centuries. Yet modern scholarship is clear that the work as we know it did not spring fully formed from the mind of a single historical Sun Tzu in one pristine moment. The problem of dating arises from the way the text is embedded in a broader lineage of military writing, and from the fact that the earliest surviving editions come from later dynasties than the era traditionally associated with Sun Tzu. If we ask who Sun Tzu was, we encounter a constellation of possibilities: a legendary figure, a compiler, a set of anonymous authors, or a composite of several hands brought together across generations. In some versions, the chapters read as a practical handbook, while in others they bear the marks of philosophical reflection, a fusion with ritual and governance discourse, or even with religious and cosmological language connected to the culture that produced them. This is not merely a question of erudition, it matters for interpretation. If The Art of War is a late medieval or even early modern synthesis about ancient practice, we must adjust our expectations about its claims to timelessness or universality. If conversely we can identify strands that plausibly trace back to earlier periods in Chinese military thought, that moves us towards seeing Sun Tzu as part of a living tradition rather than a single oracle. The dating issue dovetails with the issue of translation. The idea that a text is translatable into another language without loss is a comforting but often misleading assumption, especially when the language at issue carries not only propositional content but tacit cultural assumptions, rhetorical conventions, and strategic categories that do not map cleanly onto Western vocabularies of war and ethics. When we translate The Art of War as a technical manual about conquest and defeat, we may miss the subtle moral economy that governs the text's recommendations about leadership, governance, and the management of risk. And when the phrase "all warfare is based on deception" appears in English, it can carry with it a particular valence, one that emphasizes cunning at the expense of prudence or vice versa, depending on the translator's orientation and the reader's predispositions. Across centuries and geographies, the reception of Sun Tzu has varied not only with language but with the moral politics of the readers. In East Asia, for example, the text has often been read as a guideline for ruling well, an instrument for governance that must be weighed against Confucian ideals of virtue, benevolence, and the mandate of heaven. In this frame, Sun Tzu does not stand alone but sits in an ongoing conversation with Confucian virtue ethics, Taoist perspectives on action and non-action, and legalist pragmatism that prioritized order and efficiency. The upshot is that the same lines, "the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," or "if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles," can be read as calls for ethical restraint, for strategic prudence, or for cunning disguised as restraint, depending on the interpretive frame and the political ends in view. Across the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean littoral and beyond, readers have adapted Sun Tzu to their own circumstances, injecting or resisting the text with concerns about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the moral limits of force. From this vantage point, the intercultural reception of Sun Tzu becomes a provocative case study in translation, interpretation, and the politics of knowledge. To read Sun Tzu critically is to acknowledge that no single translation or edition captures the totality of what the text might signify in different contexts. It also means recognizing that the historical Silk Road of ideas carried not only practical techniques, but also moral and political assumptions that can travel, transform, or collide with local traditions. When Sun Tzu is employed in Western strategic cultures or in global corporate classrooms, it is tempting to treat him as a universal founder of a rational, efficient art of strategy. But the critical approach insists on paying attention to the contingencies, the particular goals of the readers, the epistemic commitments they bring, and the societal norms they wish to uphold. Let us turn now to the ethical implications of deception, a central thread of Sun Tzu's logic that has traveled far beyond the battlefield. Deception is often invoked as a core strategic device. All warfare is based on deception. If deception is a fixture of Sun Tzu's method, what does that mean for ethics in our time, especially in domains where trust is a precondition for cooperation, such as business, politics, and international relations? It is not enough to treat deception as a blunt instrument to be deployed whenever convenient. We must ask whether deception is morally permissible, under what conditions, and to what ends. We must also interrogate the idea that deception is separable from other strategic virtues: prudence, restraint, proportionality, and the protection of innocence. Sun Tzu's logic does not exist in a vacuum. It presumes a context in which outcomes are measured by victory or survival in conflict, or by some balancing of state interests that logic of statecraft presumes as legitimate. Yet in modern democracies and global markets, deception destabilizes institutions, corrodes trust, and undermines social cooperation when it leaks beyond the battlefield into ordinary life. Consider the domain of business. The entrepreneurial world is full of strategies that resemble Sun Tzu's moves, signaling strength, concealing weaknesses, timing actions to maximize leverage, and shaping rivals' perceptions. There is much to admire in the discipline, efficiency, and strategic clarity these moves can cultivate, but there is also a cost. When deception becomes normalized, it erodes the social capital that markets rely on: trust, predictability, credible communications, and reputational integrity. The ethical risk is not merely that a slick campaign might manipulate a consumer or investor. It is that a culture of strategic deception can bleed into governance, where compliance and oversight structures depend on reliable information and a shared commitment to ethical norms. The challenge is to distinguish between deception that serves legitimate strategic ends, protecting sensitive information, safeguarding privacy, maintaining competitive integrity, and deception that simply seeks to mislead for advantage, eroding the social contract that makes cooperation possible in the first place. In politics, deception has a long and fraught lineage, from propaganda to strategic misinformation campaigns. Sun Tzu's claim that deception can be an instrument of victory is often invoked to justify rough political realism. But to read Sun Tzu this way is to risk an ahistorical slide into cynicism unless we ask what the ethical guardrails should be. A central question is whether deception is ever justifiable as a means to larger goods, such as peace, stability, or the protection of vulnerable populations. If the aim is ambiguous, or if the deception becomes a tool of coercion, domination, or suppression of dissent, a deeper moral interrogation is warranted. Kant's categorical imperative reminds us to treat persons as ends in themselves, not merely as means to an end. Virtue ethics would push us to consider what kind of character is cultivated by a life that normalizes deception as a professional habit. International law and human rights standards demand a baseline of truthfulness and transparency in diplomacy, even when tactical ambiguity or national security concerns might tempt a different path. The tension between a strategic imperative and an ethical obligation becomes acute when deception is generalized rather than restricted to specific contexts. Even as we resist a simplistic, one-sided acceptance of deception as a universal virtue or a mandatory tactic, we must respect Sun Tzu's insistence on context and proportionality. The text's strengths emerge when deception is not an unchecked sovereign principle, but rather one tool among many, weighed against prudence, necessity, and the moral consequences of action. This is where Kantian and virtue-ethical critiques meet the practice of strategic thinking. The moral agent must ask, what kind of person do I become by using deception? What kind of institution am I building if deception becomes standard operating procedure? The answer is not purely intellectual but existential. A life oriented toward trust, legitimacy, and mutual respect is more sustainable than a life oriented toward constant surprise and manipulation. As we explore these ethical dimensions, we should also examine an important cluster of arguments and counterarguments about the universality or particularity of Sun Tzu's insights. A common counterclaim is that Sun Tzu's strategic patterns may reveal universal psychological and organizational dynamics that cut across cultures, especially when read critically. Proponents of this view argue that certain patterns of human interaction, readiness, responsiveness, adaptive planning, understanding one's own limits and those of others, reflect generalizable features of conflict and cooperation that can inform any rational actor seeking to reduce risk and maximize welfare. Critics, however, caution that such universalist readings risk flattening historical particularities and cultural differences into a single template. They argue that to claim universal patterns is to assume away historical context, social norms, and ethical conventions that shape how people think about power, dignity, and the good life. A balanced stance, then, treats Sun Tzu not as a static, universal manual, but as a living archive, a set of ideas that can yield legitimate strategic insights when properly contextualized. The value of Sun Tzu arises not from a claim to timeless, ahistorical truths, but from a disciplined, ethical engagement with risk, competition, cooperation, and peace. Modern reinterpretations should foreground the text's limits as much as their strengths, and they should insist on a framework that integrates ethics with efficiency. In practice, this means asking not merely, how can we win? But also, what is the right way to win? Who benefits, who bears the costs, and how will the action be judged by future generations? Let us move to the role of deception in the broader world of contemporary life, including the misapplication of Sun Tzu's ideas into contexts where risk and harm are not contained within a single conflict, but diffuse across networks of power and information. The digital era intensifies these concerns. The manipulation of information, the shaping of public opinion through targeted messaging, the strategic use of data surveillance, and the orchestration of privacy-invasive campaigns all translate Sun Tzu's playbook into a modern form. Information warfare does not require armies to cross borders. It requires algorithms, data analysts, and network platforms that can influence, destabilize, and reconfigure political and economic landscapes with speed and scale. The question becomes how to adapt Sun Tzu to such a milieu without surrendering essential commitments to truth, autonomy, and human dignity. If deception in an online environment can cause real-world harm, distorting elections, eroding trust in institutions, enabling manipulation of vulnerable populations, then we must ask what a responsible interpretation looks like. Does it demand new ethical constraints, stronger transparency, more robust defenses for privacy, or a combination of all these? Deception in the digital age also interfaces with privacy and autonomy. If Sun Tzu's maxim is that the best victory is that which gains without fighting, one might argue that a strategic approach to information integrity, privacy protection, and transparent governance can be a peaceful, prudent form of victory. In other words, the most sophisticated form of strategic thinking in a modern information society may be to prevent the conflict altogether by creating ships of trust, not fleets of deception. Yet it would be a mistake to use this as a blanket rejection of deception as conceptually legitimate in certain tightly defined contexts. Consider, for example, a corporate security environment in which a company must protect sensitive innovations from industrial espionage. Deception might be justified as a protective measure, but the ethical calculus must account for the potential harm to consumers, competitors, and the broader market if such deception leaks or is generalized. The line between legitimate security and corrosive manipulation can be thin and difficult to discern in practice, and this is why critical scrutiny and transparent governance matter so deeply. We must also consider how the text has mediated risks of militarism and coercion in ways that are not easily dismissed. The simple use of Sun Tzu as a justification for stronger militarism can be seductive for policymakers who face high-stakes decisions about security, deterrence, and defense procurement. If we interpret the text as a license to maximize leverage and to impose conditions on others based on perceived efficiency, we risk normalizing coercion as a tool of political legitimacy. The reduction of human beings to strategic variables, assets, threats, or bargaining chips invites a dangerous simplification that undermines the moral claims of sovereignty, human rights, and the rule of law. The counterweight to this risk lies in keeping a robust engagement with normative theories and international norms that insist on restraint, proportion, accountability, and the protection of noncombatants. In that sense, Sun Tzu's general counsel about pragmatism and efficiency can be used to justify both restraint and aggression, depending on who interprets it and for what ends. The critical approach, then, is to insist that strategic doctrine remain embedded within a larger ethical and legal architecture that holds leaders to account and keeps the door open to peace as a legitimate strategic objective. Intercultural critique complicates these concerns. Some scholars and post-colonial thinkers argue that Sun Tzu has been used to rationalize Western hegemonic projects, an appropriation that recasts non-Western strategic thought into a toolkit for domination. The worry here is not merely about who claims ownership of a text, but about how translating and applying Sun Tzu reflects and reinforces power dynamics epistemic hierarchies, and economic interests. Post-colonial critiques rightly remind us that the strategies of Sun Tzu cannot be extracted from the structural asymmetries of global history, where cultures are often placed in relation to one another as objects of study, rather than as agents in dialogue. Translation acts become acts of cultural negotiation, not moral surrender. If Sun Tzu is used to empower entrepreneurial elites or national security states at the expense of vulnerable communities, then the ethical costs are high. The antidote is not a blanket rejection of Sun Tzu's insights, but a vigilant, self-critical practice. To read the text with awareness of its historical contingency, to test it against universalist ethical commitments, and to insist on justice, human rights, and democratic accountability as non-negotiable benchmarks for its application. A practical way to bring this critical stance into real-world use is to enter into a dialogue that connects Sun Tzu with other streams of thought across disciplines. Cross-references to Kant and virtue ethics offer a normative anchor. Treat persons not as mere means, but as ends with dignity. In the context of international law, we can read Sun Tzu through the lens of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, recognizing that even in a world of strategic realism, there are permissible grounds and impermissible methods for waging conflict, and that restraint and proportion are legitimate, often legally binding, constraints. Post-colonial and intercultural critiques remind us to question the epistemic privilege that often accompanies strategic discourse, to attend to the voices of those who have been historically marginalized by global power structures, and to ask whether certain interpretive habits reproduce hierarchies rather than promote flourishing. Incorporating digital strategy and information security into the cross-references expands the conversation into contemporary domains. Information warfare, cyber operations, and privacy-preserving design are now central to strategic theory for citizens, corporations, and states alike. Sun Tzu's insistence on understanding the terrain, the enemy, and the conditions for victory translates into a modern imperative to understand data landscapes, network topologies, and the sources of political and economic leverage. Yet the same principles also demand caution, to ensure that strategic calculations do not erode the civil liberties that sustain legitimate governance, and to resist the temptation to deploy coercive tactics that undermine the moral legitimacy of a polity. Reading Sun Tzu in concert with ethical theories and legal norms thus provides a way to navigate the digital age with both strategic acuity and moral sensitivity. To illustrate these ideas with concrete examples, let us consider several practical scenarios. First, ethical concerns around deception and manipulation in business and politics. Imagine a multinational company that uses sophisticated data analytics and targeted messaging to influence consumer choices in ways that are technically legal but ethically questionable. It may deploy micro-targeting to manipulate vulnerable populations by exploiting cognitive biases, shaping political preferences during sensitive moments, or suppressing dissent by blending persuasion with misinformation. The Sun Tzu-inspired defense of deception would warn that the company's competitive edge relies on controlling information asymmetries, stealth, and misdirection. Yet the counterargument is powerful. Deception that harms public trust, distorts democratic processes, or erodes market integrity harms not only the broader social order, but the company's own long-term interests. A sound strategic approach, then, would demand principled boundaries, transparent disclosure about data use, robust governance, and independent oversight. The aim would be to align strategic efficiency with ethical accountability, so the pursuit of advantage does not become a surefire path to systemic ruin. Second, misapplied competition that erodes trust or ignores collaborative potential. Consider a sector where firms relentlessly chase market share through aggressive price wars, aggressive patent strategies, and aggressive non-disclosure agreements that block knowledge sharing and stifle innovation. A Sun Tzu-inspired reading might celebrate the ability to outmaneuver rivals, to leverage deception, and to carve out the most favorable conditions. But the long-term consequences include a chilling of cooperative norms, a breakdown of trust among competitors, and a weakening of the ecosystem that supports innovation. If you extinguish the cooperative potential that helps multiple players invest in shared infrastructure, standardization, and open research, you may end up with a brittle landscape in which a single misstep by any actor yields cascading harm. The counterweight to ruthless competition is the recognition that strategic capacity grows most durably in networks of trust, coupled with transparent rules and norms that discipline aggressive behavior and encourage collaboration where it is mutually beneficial. Third, peacetime uses in management and policy analysis. Sun Tzu's emphasis on situational awareness, swift decision-making, and the art of leveraging existing conditions can inform peacetime strategies in both corporate and governmental arenas. In management, leaders can draw on Sun Tzu for lessons about aligning organizational design with strategic context, balancing short-term efficiency with long-term resilience, and cultivating an adaptive culture that responds to changing environments. In policy analysis, the text can offer a language for thinking about deterrence, crisis management, and governance, without automatically equating strength with aggression. The risk, of course, is to overfit Sun Tzu to peacetime contexts where competitive dynamics may be less acute, and where the moral stakes of decision-making demand explicit attention to human welfare, social equity, and the protection of rights. The balanced approach would be to integrate Sun Tzu with tools from organizational theory, risk assessment, and public ethics, so that strategies are not only effective but legitimate and humane. Fourth, digital age challenges such as information warfare and privacy. The internet amplifies Sun Tzu's concerns about terrain, perception, and timing, while also exposing the dangers of a purely instrumental ethic that reduces human beings to data points or signals in a system. In the era of social media and real-time surveillance, a prudent interpretation of Sun Tzu calls for a careful calibration of information operations: what to reveal, what to withhold, what to shield, and how to make room for accountability. A responsible frame would place privacy as a strategic asset rather than a mere legal obligation. It would demand robust protections for data subjects, transparent governance for AI systems, and human-centered design that respects autonomy. The danger lies in a technologically deterministic reading that treats information as an unbounded resource to be mined and weaponized. The antidote is to anchor Sun Tzu's insights and commitments to justice, proportionality, and protection of noncombatants, extending the concept of strategic advantage to include moral advantages, genuine legitimacy, social trust, and democratic resilience. Fifth, diverse cultural reinterpretations in different regions. Sun Tzu has been interpreted with various aims in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and in Western contexts. In Japan, for instance, the text has sometimes been read in dialogue with Bushido, emphasizing discipline and loyalty alongside tactical cunning. In Korea, it has entered into civil-military discourse and statecraft with unique emphases on collective responsibility and social harmony. In Southeast Asia and beyond, the text migrates into public administration, corporate training, and comparative religion in ways that reflect local ideas about authority, community, and moral order. Western reinterpretations, often shaped by Clausewitz and Machiavelli, tend to frame Sun Tzu as a strict model of strategic efficiency compatible with modern managerialism and geopolitical realism. The risk is that these various reinterpretations yield a patchwork of theories that, when deployed without sensitivity to historical and cultural nuance, risk misrepresenting Sun Tzu's original aims or eroding the particular values of the societies in which the text has become meaningful. A more robust approach would treat Sun Tzu as a cultural artifact that invites cross-cultural dialogue, not a universal instrument for all occasions or a one-size-fits-all algorithm for power. It would encourage readers to attend to the moral and political norms that shape different communities, and to ask how Sun Tzu can be read as a resource that supports flourishing within particular traditions, rather than as abstract authorization for domination. In this carefully cross-referenced practice, the virtues of doubt and humility are crucial. Methodological humility means resisting the temptation to extract universal lessons from a single text without checking its historical provenance, its normative commitments, and the contexts in which its ideas have become legible and influential. It means acknowledging that no single framework can adequately explain the dynamics of all political and social life, and that mixed methods, philosophical critique, historical contextualization, comparative ethics, political theory, legal analysis, and empirical study are necessary to approach a problem with care. When we read Sun Tzu, we should not assume an ahistorical toolkit, but rather a historical toolkit that is open to revision in light of new evidence, ethical considerations, and the lived experiences of diverse communities. This is not a call to dismiss Sun Tzu as irrelevant. It is a call to approach him as a conversation partner whose insights can illuminate our thinking, provided we keep in view the limits of his claims and the demands of our own times. Historical anecdotes can illuminate how these issues have actually played out. First, consider how East Asian governance integrated Sun Tzu across dynasties. In the long arc of Chinese and East Asian political life, Sun Tzu appears not as a solitary prophet, but as one voice among many in a culture that valued strategic thinking, administrative excellence, and the balance between strength and legitimacy. Rulers and scholars drew on the text in the service of governance, but they did so within a dynamic ecosystem of political philosophy that included Confucian ethics, legalist practicality, and Taoist reflections on natural order and non-action. The result was not a monolithic adoption of Sun Tzu as a single normative standard, but a nuanced maneuvering of ideas within the conditions of statecraft. The text could be invoked to justify a measured approach to conflict, to emphasize the importance of intelligence gathering and assimilation of information, or to advocate moderation in the use of force when the ends could be achieved through other means. The anecdotes from historical governance remind us that Sun Tzu's ideas were never isolated from the political culture in which they circulated. They were continuously adapted, debated, and reinterpreted in light of practical needs and moral concerns. A second anecdote traces the Western reception of Sun Tzu through the interwoven legacies of Clausewitz and Machiavelli. In the West, Sun Tzu came to be read alongside a robust tradition of strategic realism that already prized prudence, deterrence, and the management of political risk. Clausewitz's assertion that war is the continuation of politics by other means invites a dialogical reading with Sun Tzu's emphasis on political context, deception, and the avoidance of unnecessary warfare. Machiavelli's focus on virtue, fortune, and the conditions under which rulers maintain power provides a further point of contact, but also a warning. Sun Tzu is not simply a manual for cunning power. He is a prompt to think about the moral economy of authority and the long-term health of political communities. Contemporary corporate education has picked up these strands, adopting Sun Tzu as a way of imparting strategic clarity, situational awareness, and disciplined risk management. Yet this adoption has not been without critique. It has faced questions about the risk of instrumentalizing Sun Tzu for profit without attending to workers' rights, ethical governance, and the social responsibilities of corporations. Post-colonial critiques have indeed raised alarms about appropriation and translation, urging readers to attend to the political economy of knowledge production and to resist the flattening of diverse cultural experiences into a single, marketable formula. The anecdotes together show a broad arc. Sun Tzu travels, is translated again, used, questioned, reorganized, and sometimes reimagined to fit new orders of human life. Each phase tests the text against new conditions and asks the hard questions about what is gained and what is lost in translation and application. If we widen our lens to consider cross-references with ethics and law, it becomes clear that no reading of Sun Tzu can safely ignore normative constraints or legal boundaries. Kant's ethics, for instance, insist that we act according to maxims that could be universalized without contradiction. In Sun Tzu's world, decisions are often made in environments of uncertainty, with incomplete information and finite resources. The question then becomes how to reconcile a form of strategic rationality with the Kantian requirement that we treat persons as ends in themselves. One route is to insist that strategic planning, in its best form, respects autonomy, dignity, and rights, even when it employs deception or manipulation in a narrowly defined and ethically justified way. Another route is to ground Sun Tzu in virtue ethics, which focuses on character and the cultivation of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance in leaders. In this reading, the strategic mind is not a tool for calculating advantage alone, but a way of developing a virtuous disposition toward the good life within a community of responsible agents. These ethical alignments also intersect with international law, which provides normative anchors for the use of force and the treatment of noncombatants, and with post-colonial thought, which pushes us to consider who benefits from these strategic frameworks and who bears the costs of their implementation. In addition to ethics and law, the digital sphere offers a crucial vantage point for rethinking Sun Tzu's relevance today. Information security, privacy, and the ethics of algorithmic influence demand a careful recalibration of Sun Tzu's ideas about knowledge, perception, and deception. In the digital age, controlling the information environment is a central form of power, and the ability to shape what others think, feel, and decide can be as consequential as controlling physical territory. Yet the digital age also makes transparent governance, accountability, and social trust more essential than ever. The challenge is not to abandon Sun Tzu's insights about terrain, timing, and adaptability, but to translate them into a framework that respects democratic legitimacy, human rights, and inclusive decision-making. The aim is to preserve strategic acuity while promoting a culture in which truth-telling, consent, and privacy are valued as strategic resources in their own right. In this sense, Sun Tzu's legacy can contribute to a more nuanced understanding of strategy, one that integrates ethical commitments with practical cunning, legal obligations with innovative problem-solving, and cultural sensitivity with a universal commitment to human dignity. To synthesize these strands into a practical approach for contemporary readers, we can offer a reading method that emphasizes critical reflection, historical contextualization, and ethical evaluation. First, approach Sun Tzu as a historical artifact rather than a universal manual. Ask, what are the historical conditions that produced this text? What language, what institutions, what political concerns shaped its ideas? Second, insist on interpretive humility. Recognize that translations are not neutral. They carry the visions and blind spots of their translators. Third, foreground ethics. Bring Kantian, virtue-ethical, and rights-based frameworks to bear on questions of deception, coercion, and harm. Fourth, consider law and policy. Read Sun Tzu alongside international law, human rights norms, and governance standards to see where strategic prescriptions align with or clash with legal obligations and normative commitments. Fifth, attend to power and justice. Be alert to who benefits from a particular interpretation and who bears the costs, and value readings that enhance social trust, resilience, and peaceful coexistence. Sixth, keep a cultural conversation alive. Treat Sun Tzu as part of a global dialogue about strategy that invites other voices, other histories, and other moral grammars into the debate, rather than a one-directional conduit for Western managerialism or political realism. As we close this segment, let us reflect on the broader picture. Sun Tzu's ideas endure not because they are simple, but because they press us to think about the limits of calculation, the fragility of trust, and the moral weight of power. The text invites admiration for strategic fluency while demanding vigilance against the misapplication of such fluency in ways that harm communities, undermine democratic processes, or enable coercive governance. The questions we have raised are not abstract philosophical amusements. They map onto real-world dilemmas where strategic decisions affect lives, livelihoods, and futures. How do we balance efficiency with justice? How do we maintain legitimacy when we deploy clever means that might destabilize others or erode essential norms? How can we cultivate leadership that is both decisive and humane in an age of rapid change, where information is a strategic resource as potent as armies were in Sun Tzu's century? In the final analysis, the value of Sun Tzu lies not in the certainty of his prescriptions, but in the discipline of his questions. He invites us to examine terrain, timing, and tactic with a careful, ethical eye. He asks us to weigh the costs of victory against the possibility of enduring peace, to consider the human consequences of strategic action, and to ensure that our search for advantage does not outrun our obligation to others. The challenges of authenticity, translation, and reception remind us that knowledge is never neutral. It travels, mutates, and bears the marks of those who carry it. The ethical implications of deception compel us to specify the conditions under which strategic maneuvering is permissible and to insist on transparency, accountability, and respect for persons. The risks of militarism and coercion caution us against an uncritical appropriation of Sun Tzu by powerful actors, urging instead a disciplined approach that foregrounds human rights and international norms. And the diverse cultural reinterpretations of Sun Tzu across regions remind us that strategy is always embedded in a larger social and moral order, and that responsible interpretation requires listening to voices outside the dominant discourse. If we end with one guiding principle, it would be this: read Sun Tzu with methodological humility and with a steady hand on ethical rudders. Let the text illuminate what is possible in the world, but refuse to approve what could be unjust, undemocratic, or inhumane. Let it sharpen our sense of risk and our capacity to respond adaptively to changing circumstances, without letting strategic cleverness eclipsed by moral clarity. Let it help us imagine not merely how to win, but how to live together in a political and economic landscape that is increasingly interconnected and morally complex. In doing so, we honor both the historical wisdom of a text that has traveled across centuries and cultures, and the living responsibilities we bear as readers, teachers, policymakers, business leaders, and citizens of a global commonwealth. The conversation does not end here. The next steps involve engaged, ongoing dialogue across disciplines and cultures, ongoing critical appraisal of new interpretations, and a commitment to applying Sun Tzu in ways that strengthen peace, protect rights, and promote shared flourishing. We must continually ask, are we using Sun Tzu to defend tyranny or to safeguard human dignity? Are we extracting timeless methods at the expense of historical truth, or are we drawing from a long tradition of thought a cautious set of tools that, when tempered by ethics, can help us think more clearly about conflict and cooperation? The answers will not be fixed, they will evolve as our societies evolve. But by approaching Sun Tzu with reverence for the past, humility about our present, and responsibility toward our future, we can cultivate a reading that is not only analytically rigorous but morally oriented, one that respects the historical complex of the text while recognizing the legitimate demands of the world we inhabit today. In closing, let me offer one more reflection that returns us to the core of why this matters for modern life. Strategy in the 21st century is not merely about winning in a narrow sense, but about stewarding the conditions under which peaceful, just, and prosperous communities can thrive. The idea Sun Tzu presents, alignment of means with ends, timing, perception, discipline, adaptability, are not inherently benevolent or malevolent. They become moral when tethered to commitments to dignity, rights, and the common good. As we teach, study, and apply these ideas in policy rooms, boardrooms, and classrooms around the world, we must do so with sensitivity to language, history, and power, with a disciplined skepticism about universal claims, with a commitment to transparency, accountability, and the protection of the vulnerable, and with an openness to diverse interpretations that enrich our understanding rather than shrinking it. That is how we read Sun Tzu critically and responsibly, not as a sacred code to be applied unthinkingly, but as a living text that helps us think more carefully about how to live with others in a world where strategy, ethics, and humanity are inextricably linked.